Economics is perhaps most recognizable in the forms we encounter in our daily lives: prices at the grocery store or interest rates on a mortgage. Yet its principles stretch far beyond the checkout line. These fundamental concepts are at work in government policy, in international relations, and most critically, in determining how societies allocate scarce resources. Economics serves as the study of choice under scarcity, examining how individuals, businesses, and governments make decisions when resources are limited but wants are unlimited. Through this process of analysis, economists seek to understand patterns in production, consumption, and distribution. Like other social sciences, economics relies on human behavior as its subject matter, though unlike psychology or sociology, it focuses specifically on decisions involving material welfare and resource allocation. Without economic analysis, the global marketplace would remain an incomprehensible collection of transactions with no underlying logic. In addition to explaining individual choices, economics also examines systemic outcomes. Markets coordinate millions of independent decisions, somehow transforming self-interested behavior into orderly patterns of production and exchange. Meanwhile, governments intervene to correct market failures, redistribute income, and stabilize economic fluctuations. The term economics comes from the Greek oikonomia, meaning household management, and appropriately so. Many economic principles involve managing resources efficiently, though not all economic activity is so rational or tidy. Some decisions reflect psychological biases, others respond to institutional constraints rather than pure market forces. The discipline divides into two main branches: microeconomics and macroeconomics. Microeconomics examines individual decision makers, including consumers purchasing goods and firms producing them. Macroeconomics studies aggregates phenomena such as national output, unemployment, and inflation. These organisms are gathered under the umbrella of economic science, a field that has evolved considerably since its systematic origins in the 18th century. While economists have catalogued principles governing exchange and production, debates persist about policy applications and optimal institutional arrangements. Among the central questions are familiar challenges: how to promote prosperity, reduce poverty, and balance efficiency against equity. All represent tensions within economics, which in turn resides within the broader domain of social sciences. Though economics once overlapped considerably with moral philosophy, it has become increasingly mathematical and empirical. Unlike purely theoretical disciplines, economics depends on data to test hypotheses and refine models. Economists measure variables, estimate relationships, and forecast outcomes, though predictions remain uncertain given the complexity of human systems and the constant evolution of economic institutions. Economics, like all social sciences, possesses a conceptual architecture marked by fundamental principles. Each economic decision is shaped by scarcity, the condition in which unlimited wants meet limited resources. This scarcity applies universally. Individuals face constraints on time and income. Firms confront limits on capital and labor. Governments must allocate finite tax revenues among competing priorities. Even wealthy societies experience scarcity, though its manifestation differs from that in poor nations. Resources fall into four broad categories, collectively termed factors of production. Land encompasses all natural resources, from agricultural soil to mineral deposits to the electromagnetic spectrum used for broadcasting. Labor includes human effort, both physical and mental, supplied by workers of varying skills and education levels. Capital refers not to money, but to produced goods used in further production, machinery, factories, computers, and infrastructure. Finally, entrepreneurship combines the other factors through innovation and risk-taking, organizing production, and bearing uncertainty. These four inputs generate virtually all economic output. Scarcity necessitates choice. When resources cannot satisfy all wants simultaneously, individuals and societies must decide which desires to pursue and which to forego. This reality creates opportunity cost, the value of the next best alternative, sacrificed when making a decision. Consider a student choosing between attending college and working full-time. The opportunity cost of college includes not only tuition and fees, but also the wages foregone during those years of study. That is, the true cost exceeds the direct financial expenditure, because it includes what must be surrendered. Opportunity cost appears in every economic decision, though it often remains invisible. A government spending an additional $1 billion on military equipment cannot simultaneously spend that billion on education or healthcare. A firm investing in new production facilities cannot use those same funds for research and development or dividend payments. A worker spending hours commuting cannot use those hours for leisure or additional work. These trade-offs are unavoidable consequences of scarcity. Economists employ marginal thinking to analyze decisions, examining the additional benefits and costs of small changes rather than comparing total levels. A rational decision-maker continues an activity as long as marginal benefit exceeds marginal cost. A firm expands production as long as the revenue from one more unit exceeds the cost of producing it. A consumer purchases additional units of a good as long as the satisfaction from one more unit exceeds its price. This marginal analysis explains why optimal choices rarely involve all or nothing decisions. The best solution typically lies somewhere between extremes. The production possibilities frontier illustrates these concepts graphically. This curve shows the maximum combinations of two goods an economy can produce given its available resources and technology. Consider a simplified economy producing only healthcare and education. Points on the frontier represent efficient production, using all available resources fully. Points inside the frontier indicate inefficiency, wasted resources, or unemployment. Points outside the frontier are currently unattainable, given existing constraints. The frontier's shape reveals opportunity costs. To produce more healthcare, society must sacrifice some education, diverting doctors, nurses, and facilities from teaching to treating patients. The frontier typically bows outward, reflecting increasing opportunity costs. As society produces more of one good, each additional unit requires sacrificing ever larger amounts of the other good. This occurs because resources are not perfectly adaptable. A teacher cannot easily become a surgeon. A classroom building cannot readily convert into a hospital. Economic growth shifts the entire frontier outward, expanding the range of possible combinations. Technological improvements, capital accumulation, labor force growth, and better education all contribute to this expansion. With economic growth, society can produce more healthcare and more education simultaneously, escaping the original trade-off. However, achieving growth itself requires trade-offs. Resources devoted to building new factories or training workers cannot satisfy immediate consumption desires. Scarcity also creates competition. When multiple parties desire the same limited resources, some mechanism must determine who receives them. Markets allocate through prices. Higher prices ration scarce goods to those willing and able to pay most. Non-market systems employ different allocation mechanisms. Governments may distribute through political processes. Traditional societies may rely on custom or hereditary claims. Queues allocate based on willingness to wait. Lotteries distribute randomly. Each mechanism generates different outcomes and creates different incentives. The concept of trade-offs extends beyond material goods to include intangibles. Societies balance freedom against security, efficiency against equity, present consumption against future investment. No policy achieves all desirable objectives simultaneously. Minimum wage laws may raise incomes for some workers, while reducing employment opportunities for others. Environmental regulations improve air quality, but increase production costs. Progressive taxation enhances equity, but potentially dampens work incentives. Economists analyze these trade-offs without prescribing particular value judgments, though the boundary between positive analysis and normative recommendation often blurs. In this way, scarcity, choice, and opportunity cost form the conceptual foundation of economic reasoning. Every decision involves weighing alternatives. Every benefit comes at some cost. Every resource devoted to one purpose cannot serve another. These simple principles, rigorously applied, generate powerful insights into human behavior and social organization. These individual choices aggregate into patterns. How societies organize these decisions, who produces what, how production occurs, and who receives the output, defines economic systems. Different institutional arrangements answer these fundamental questions in strikingly different ways. Though economic principles operate universally, their application varies considerably across societies. Three fundamental questions face every economic system, regardless of its organizational structure. What goods and services should be produced? How should production occur? For whom should output be distributed? Traditional economies answer these questions through custom and habit. Command economies centralize decisions in government hands. Market economies rely on decentralized choices coordinated by prices. Mixed economies, the most common arrangement in practice, combine elements from multiple systems. Traditional economies, the oldest form of economic organization, base decisions on historical patterns and cultural norms. What was produced previously continues to be produced. How ancestors worked determines current methods. Distribution follows established customs, often tied to family relationships or social hierarchies. Such systems appear in isolated communities and among groups maintaining ancestral practices. Though purely traditional, economies have become increasingly rare as market forces penetrate remote regions. Command economies, also termed planned economies, vest economic decisions in government agencies. Central planners determine production targets for various goods and services, allocate resources among industries, and distribute output according to state priorities. The Soviet Union exemplified this model from 1917 till its collapse in 1991. Government ministries issued detailed production quotas specifying quantities, qualities, and delivery schedules for thousands of products. State ownership of factories, farms, and resources eliminated private property in productive assets. The Soviet experience revealed both capabilities and limitations of command systems. Rapid industrialization occurred during the 1930s, transforming a predominantly agricultural society into an industrial power. The state mobilized resources for massive projects, heavy industry, military production, and infrastructure development. However, inefficiencies multiplied over time. Without price signals reflecting scarcity, planners made arbitrary decisions. Factories produced goods regardless of consumer demand, generating shortages of desired items alongside surpluses of unwanted ones. Workers lacked incentives for effort or innovation, as wages bore little relationship to productivity. By the 1980s, the system stagnated, contributing to the Soviet Union's eventual dissolution. Contemporary North Korea maintains a command economy, one of the few remaining examples. The government controls virtually all economic activity, from agricultural production to industrial output. Chronic shortages and periodic famines demonstrate the system's continuing difficulties in allocating resources efficiently. Market economies organize production and distribution through decentralized decisions. Private individuals and firms own most productive resources. Entrepreneurs decide what to produce based on profit opportunities. Workers choose occupations based on wages and preferences. Consumers select purchases based on prices and incomes. Coordination occurs through markets where buyers and sellers interact, establishing prices that signal relative scarcity. When demand exceeds supply, prices rise, encouraging increased production and reduced consumption until equilibrium restores. When supply exceeds demand, prices fall, discouraging production and encouraging consumption. Adam Smith famously described this coordination as an invisible hand guiding self-interested individuals to serve social welfare. A baker produces bread not from benevolence, but from self-interest, seeking profit, yet consumers benefit from the baker's production. Prices coordinate millions of such independent decisions without central direction. Property rights form the institutional foundation of market economies. When individuals own resources and can transfer ownership voluntarily, markets emerge naturally. Secure property rights encourage investment, as owners expect to reap returns from improvements. Weak or absent property rights undermine market function, creating uncertainty that discourages productive activity. However, purely unregulated markets exist nowhere. All market economies include substantial government involvement. Governments define and enforce property rights through legal systems. They provide public goods, including national defense and infrastructure. They regulate certain industries, particularly those involving public health and safety. They redistribute income through taxation and transfer payments. They stabilize economic fluctuations through monetary and fiscal policies. Mixed economies acknowledge this reality. Most developed nations combine market allocation with government intervention. Though the balance varies, the United States relies heavily on markets while maintaining government programs for retirement security, health care for elderly and poor populations, education and infrastructure. Scandinavian countries feature larger government sectors, more extensive social insurance, and higher tax rates, yet still depend fundamentally on market mechanisms. Singapore combines free trade and minimal business regulation with substantial government ownership of land and strategic industries. China presents a hybrid of state ownership alongside private enterprise and market pricing, though government influence remains pervasive. The spectrum between pure command and pure market systems reflects different values and historical experiences. Societies emphasizing individual freedom and efficiency gravitate toward market solutions. Those prioritizing equality and security expand government roles. Historical events shape preferences. The Great Depression convinced many Americans that markets required government stabilization. Post-war Western Europe, rebuilding from devastation, constructed extensive welfare states. Former communist nations transitioning to market systems initially experienced disruption, influencing public opinion about appropriate government involvement. In practice, even market-oriented economies maintain considerable government activity, while command economies develop informal markets where official allocation fails. The question facing policymakers involves not whether government participates in economic life, but how extensively and through which mechanisms. In market-oriented systems, prices serve as the primary coordination mechanism. Understanding how prices emerge and evolve requires examining supply and demand, the foundational concepts explaining market behavior. Prices in market economies perform multiple functions simultaneously. They convey information about relative scarcity. They provide incentives for producers and consumers. They coordinate decisions across millions of independent actors. Like decomposers in an ecosystem breaking down organic matter and recycling nutrients, prices process information from countless transactions and redistribute resources throughout the economic system without central coordination. The mechanism generating prices rests on supply and demand. Demand represents the quantity of a good or service consumers are willing and able to purchase at various prices during a specific time period. This definition contains three essential elements. Willingness indicates desire. Ability requires purchasing power. The time dimension recognizes that demand refers to a flow, not a stock. Consumers might desire expensive automobiles, but desire without income produces no effective demand. The law of demand describes an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded, holding other factors constant. As price rises, quantity demanded falls. As price declines, quantity demanded increases. This pattern appears consistently across markets. When gasoline prices spike, consumers reduce driving, consolidate trips, and consider more fuel-efficient vehicles. When housing costs rise, potential buyers delay purchases, seek smaller properties, or remain renters. When wages in a particular occupation fall, fewer workers supply their labor to that field. Several factors explain this inverse relationship. The substitution effect occurs as consumers shift toward alternatives when a goods price rises. Higher beef prices encourage chicken or fish consumption. Higher movie ticket prices promote streaming services at home. The income effect reflects diminished purchasing power. When prices rise, a given income buys fewer goods at higher prices, forcing consumers to reduce purchases. Diminishing marginal utility, the declining additional satisfaction from successive units, implies consumers value additional units less than initial ones, requiring lower prices to induce additional purchases. Supply represents the quantity producers are willing and able to offer at various prices during a specific time period. Here, ability depends on production capacity and resource availability rather than purchasing power. The law of supply describes a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. As prices rise, producers offer more for sale. As prices fall, they offer less. This reflects increasing costs. Producing additional output typically requires paying higher wages to attract more workers, using less efficient equipment, or purchasing more expensive raw materials. Higher prices justify these additional costs. Consider wheat farmers deciding how much acreage to plant. At low wheat prices, only the most fertile land with lowest costs merits cultivation. As prices rise, farmers expand to less productive land, hire additional workers, and purchase more equipment. The relationship between price and quantity supplied reflects these rising marginal costs. Market equilibrium occurs where supply and demand intersect. The price at which quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. At this equilibrium price, all consumers willing to pay that amount can purchase the good, and all producers willing to accept that price can sell their output. No shortages or surpluses exist. No pressure emerges to change the price. This equilibrium creates adjustment forces. When price exceeds equilibrium, quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded, creating a surplus. Producers competing for sales reduce prices. As prices fall, quantity demanded rises and quantity supplied falls until equilibrium restores. When price falls below equilibrium, quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied, generating shortages. Consumers competing for limited supplies bid prices higher. As prices rise, quantity supplied increases and quantity demanded decreases until markets clear. These adjustment processes operate continuously. The gasoline market experiences daily shifts. Crude oil price changes alter supply. Seasonal driving patterns shift demand. Prices adjust accordingly, rising during summer vacation months when demand peaks and falling during winter when demand softens. Housing markets respond more slowly, given construction lags and geographic immobility, but the same forces operate. Labour markets clear through wage adjustments. though various rigidities slow the process. Changes in factors other than price shift entire demand or supply curves rather than moving along existing curves. Demand shifts respond to changes in consumer incomes, preferences, prices of related goods, expectations about future conditions, and the number of buyers. Rising incomes increase demand for most goods. Changing preferences, perhaps driven by health information or advertising, shift demand. Price changes in substitute goods affect demand inversely, while price changes in complementary goods affect demand directly. Expectations about future price increases encourage current purchases. Population growth expands the number of buyers. Supply shifts reflect changes in input prices, technology, prices of related goods in production, expectations, and the number of sellers. Declining input costs, perhaps from technological improvements in producing those inputs, shifts supply rightward. Better production technology reduces costs, encouraging expanded output at any given price. Producers of multiple goods reallocate resources based on relative profitability. Expectations about future prices influence current production decisions. Entry of new firms increases supply, while exits contract it. Through this mechanism, markets achieve coordination. Prices adjust continuously to changing conditions, reflecting new information and altered circumstances. No central authority directs this process. No comprehensive plan guides it. Individual decisions, motivated by self-interest and constrained by prices, somehow aggregate into orderly patterns of production and consumption. However, not all markets function identically. The competitive structure of a market, how many sellers participate, whether products differ, how easily new firms enter, fundamentally alters pricing dynamics and resource allocation outcomes. Markets are organized into several distinct structures, each categorized according to the number of firms competing, the degree of product differentiation, and the ease with which new firms can enter or exit. These structures form a spectrum ranging from perfect competition, where numerous firms sell identical products, to monopoly, where a single firm dominates without close substitutes. Between these extremes lie monopolistic competition and oligopoly, intermediate forms combining elements of both competitive and monopolistic behavior. Perfect competition represents an idealized benchmark rarely achieved in practice, but useful for analyzing market efficiency. 4 conditions define this structure. First, many buyers and sellers participate, each too small to influence market price individually. Second, firms sell homogeneous products, identical in the eyes of consumers. Third, perfect information prevails, with all participants knowing prices and product qualities. Fourth, no barriers prevent firms from entering or exiting the industry. Under these conditions, individual firms become price takers, accepting the market price as given and deciding only how much quantity to produce. Agricultural markets approximate perfect competition more closely than most industries. Wheat farmers produce essentially identical output. Thousands of farms supply the market. Information about prices circulates widely. Entry requires only land and equipment, substantial investments, but not insurmountable barriers. Each farmer faces a horizontal demand curve at the market price. Producing one more bushel or one fewer affects the farm's revenue, but not the market price. Perfect competition generates efficient outcomes. Price equals marginal cost, the additional cost of producing one more unit. This ensures resources flow to their most valued uses. Firms earning economic profits attract new entrants, expanding supply until profits disappear. Firms suffering losses exit, contracting supply until remaining firms break even. The adjustment process continues until price settles at minimum average cost, the most efficient production level. Monopoly occupies the opposite extreme. A single seller dominates the market with no close substitutes for its product. High barriers prevent potential competitors from entering. These barriers take various forms. Government may grant exclusive rights through patents, copyrights, or licenses. Natural monopoly occurs when economies of scale make a single large producer more efficient than multiple small ones. Network effects create monopoly when a product's value increases with the number of users. Control of essential resources can exclude competitors. Public utilities historically exemplified monopoly. Electricity distribution, water supply, and local telephone service involved huge fixed costs for infrastructure, but low marginal costs for additional customers. Duplicating these networks made no economic sense. One firm could serve the entire market more efficiently than several competing firms. Governments typically regulated these natural monopolies, controlling prices and service quality while granting exclusive territories. Unlike competitive firms, monopolists face downward-sloping demand curves. Selling more requires accepting lower prices. This creates a gap between price and marginal cost. Monopolists restrict output below competitive levels and charge prices above marginal cost, maximizing profit at society's expense. Consumer surplus transfers to producer surplus, and deadweight loss emerges from transactions that would benefit both parties but don't occur due to inflated prices. Patent protection creates temporary monopolies deliberately. Society grants inventors exclusive rights for limited periods, typically 20 years, to encourage innovation. Pharmaceutical companies rely heavily on patent protection to recoup research and development costs. Generic drug manufacturers enter markets once patents expire, driving prices toward competitive levels. This trade-off between innovation incentives and consumer welfare pervades patent policy debates. Oligopoly describes markets with few sellers, typically 3 to 10 firms accounting for the majority of sales. Interdependence characterizes oligopolistic decision-making. Each firm's profit depends not only on its own actions, but also on competitors' responses. Pricing decisions require anticipating rivals' reactions. Product development considers competitive offerings. Advertising battles attempt to capture market share from established competitors. Automobile manufacturing, commercial aircraft production, and wireless telecommunications exhibit oligopolistic structures. A handful of firms dominate each industry. Substantial barriers prevent new entry, including huge capital requirements, technological sophistication, and brand loyalty. Oligopolists may compete aggressively on price, particularly during demand downturns. Alternatively, they may engage in tacit collusion, avoiding price competition while competing on advertising, product features, and customer service. Game theory provides tools for analyzing oligopolistic behavior. Firms face strategic dilemmas resembling the prisoner's dilemma. Each firm benefits if all maintain high prices, yet each has incentives to undercut competitors. Explicit collusion, agreeing to fix prices or divide markets, violates antitrust laws. Tacit coordination, through price leadership or parallel behavior, occurs more subtly and escapes prosecution more easily. Monopolistic competition combines elements from perfect competition and monopoly. Many firms compete, but each offers a differentiated product. Restaurants, hair salons, gas stations, and retail clothing stores exemplify this structure. Entry barriers remain low. Firms possess some price-setting power due to product differentiation, but face competition from similar offerings. A restaurant can charge slightly more than competitors if customers value its particular cuisine, atmosphere, or location, yet raising prices too high drives customers to alternatives. Product differentiation occurs along multiple dimensions. Physical characteristics differ, locations vary, service quality diverges. Brand images distinguish otherwise similar products. Firms invest in advertising to strengthen differentiation and build customer loyalty. This creates small monopolies for particular product variants, yet competition from close substitutes constrains pricing power. Monopolistic competition generates less efficiency than perfect competition. Price exceeds marginal cost, though the gap remains smaller than under monopoly. Excess capacity emerges as firms produce below minimum efficient scale. However, product variety may benefit consumers, offsetting these inefficiencies. Whether society benefits from 20 restaurant options rather than 10 remains ambiguous. The structure of a market determines outcomes beyond price. It affects product quality, innovation rates, and the division of economic surplus between producers and consumers. Consequently, governments maintain antitrust policies to prevent excessive concentration and preserve competitive forces where feasible. Understanding individual markets provides microeconomic insight, yet evaluating aggregate economic performance requires different tools and concepts. Economists measure national output, employment levels, and price changes through macroeconomic accounting systems. Like biologists who assess population health through various indicators, economists track economic performance using several key metrics. Gross domestic product quantifies total output. Inflation measures price level changes. Unemployment indicates labor market health. These statistics provide quantitative snapshots of aggregate economic conditions, enabling comparisons across time periods and between nations. Gross domestic product, GDP, measures the market value of all final goods and services produced within a nation's borders during a specific period, typically a year or quarter. This definition contains crucial qualifications. Market value means goods are valued at prices paid rather than physical quantities, allowing apples and automobiles to be summed meaningfully. Final goods excludes intermediate products used in producing other goods, avoiding double counting. Bread counts, but flour used in making bread does not, as its value already appears in the bread's price. Production within borders includes output by foreign-owned firms operating domestically, while excluding output by domestically owned firms operating abroad. The time dimension specifies that GDP measures a flow, not a stock. 3 approaches calculate GDP, each theoretically yielding identical results. The expenditure approach sums spending by various sectors. The income approach totals all income earned in production. The production approach aggregates value added at each stage of production. The expenditure method predominates in practice. The expenditure approach divides spending into 4 components. Consumption, C, includes household purchases of goods and services, from groceries to healthcare to restaurant meals. It typically represents 60 to 70% of GDP in developed economies. Investment, I, encompasses business purchases of capital equipment, residential construction, and changes in inventories. Government purchases, G, include spending on goods and services by federal, state, and local governments. Transfer payments like Social Security do not count as government purchases because they involve redistributing income rather than purchasing output. Net exports, the difference between exports X and imports M, adjusts for the fact that consumption, investment, and government spending includes some foreign-produced goods, while excluding domestically produced goods purchased abroad. The formula GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M summarizes this accounting. For the United States, recent figures show GDP around $25 trillion, with consumption near $17 trillion, investment approximately $4.5 trillion, government purchases around $4.5 trillion, and net exports negative at roughly $1 trillion as imports exceed exports. Nominal GDP measures output at current prices, making comparisons across time misleading when price levels change. An economy might report 10% nominal GDP growth, but if prices rose 10%, no real increase in production occurred. Real GDP adjusts for price changes, measuring output at constant prices from a base year. That is, real GDP reflects actual production changes rather than merely price inflation. Economists use real GDP when analysing economic growth, business cycles, and living standards. GDP per capita, total GDP divided by population, provides a rough measure of average living standards. Luxembourg reports the world's highest GDP per capita, exceeding $130,000, while dozens of nations record figures below $1,000. These vast disparities reflect differences in productivity, capital accumulation, technology, and institutions. However, GDP suffers from well-documented limitations. It excludes non-market activities including household production and volunteer work. A parent caring for children at home contributes no measured output, yet hiring a nanny increases GDP. It ignores income distribution, treating a dollar received by anyone identically regardless of circumstances. Rising GDP may accompany increasing inequality. It overlooks environmental degradation and resource depletion, counting current production while ignoring future costs. It measures market activity, not welfare, counting both beneficial spending on education and defensive expenditures on crime prevention. Inflation, the sustained increase in the overall price level, erodes purchasing power and complicates economic decision-making. Several indices track inflation. The Consumer Price Index, CPI, measures the cost of a fixed basket of goods and services purchased by typical urban consumers. Government statisticians survey prices monthly for thousands of items, from bread to rent to medical care. The percentage change in this index from one period to another represents the inflation rate. Recent US inflation rates have ranged from below 2% during the 2010s to above 7% during 2021 and 2022. The Producer Price Index, PPI, tracks prices received by domestic producers for their output, focusing on wholesale and industrial prices rather than retail consumer prices. The GDP deflator, a broader measure, includes all goods and services in GDP rather than a fixed basket. Each index serves different analytical purposes. Economists distinguish between demand-pull inflation and cost-push inflation based on underlying causes. Demand-pull inflation occurs when aggregate demand grows faster than aggregate supply, bidding up prices as consumers compete for limited output. Cost-push inflation results from rising production costs, including wages, raw materials, or energy prices which firms pass along through higher prices. Both types can operate simultaneously, complicating policy responses. Unemployment, the percentage of the labour force actively seeking work but unable to find it, provides another crucial indicator. The labour force includes employed and unemployed individuals, but excludes those not seeking work. Children, retirees, students, and discouraged workers who abandoned job searches. Recent US unemployment rates have ranged from below 4% during economic expansions to above 10% during the 2008 financial crisis and 2020 pandemic recession. Three types of unemployment exist. Frictional unemployment involves workers temporarily between jobs, searching for positions matching their skills and preferences. This represents normal labour market turnover and remains unavoidable in dynamic economies. Structural unemployment results from mismatches between worker skills and job requirements, or between worker locations and job locations. Technological change and globalization create structural unemployment as industries decline and new ones emerge. Cyclical unemployment fluctuates with business cycles, rising during recessions as aggregate demand falls and declining during expansions as demand recovers. The natural rate of unemployment, also termed the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, represents the unemployment level consistent with stable inflation. It includes frictional and structural unemployment, but not cyclical unemployment. Estimates place the US natural rate between 4 and 5% currently, though the rate varies across countries and changes over time as labour market institutions evolve. These measures provide essential information for policymakers, businesses, and citizens evaluating economic conditions. Yet they represent aggregates that obscure considerable variation beneath the surface. Growing GDP may mask rising inequality or environmental damage. Low unemployment may coexist with stagnant wages. Stable inflation may hide relative price changes affecting particular groups severely. Economists therefore examine multiple indicators simultaneously, recognizing that no single statistic captures economic health comprehensively. Among the variables influencing these measures, money occupies a central role. Its quantity, distribution, and management fundamentally shape economic activity and require institutional arrangements to maintain stability. Money, like the cellular membrane in biology, facilitates essential exchanges that would otherwise prove cumbersome or impossible. Without money, economic transactions require barter, the direct exchange of goods for other goods. Barter demands what economists call a double coincidence of wants. A shoemaker desiring bread must find a baker wanting shoes. This requirement severely limits trade. With money serving as an intermediary, the shoemaker sells shoes for money, then purchases bread with that money. The baker need not desire shoes. Money thus enables specialization and complex economic organization. Money performs three essential functions. As a medium of exchange, it facilitates transactions by serving as an intermediary in trade. As a unit of account, it provides a common measure for valuing different goods and services. Instead of quoting prices in terms of every other good, sellers quote them in monetary units. As a store of value, money allows individuals to save purchasing power over time. Income earned today can purchase goods tomorrow or next year. Effective money possesses several characteristics. Durability ensures money lasts through repeated exchanges. Paper currency and metal coins satisfy this requirement better than perishable commodities. Portability allows money to be transported easily. Lightweight currencies facilitate trade more than heavy commodities. Divisibility enables change-making and small transactions. Currency denominations ranging from cents to large bills accommodate purchases of varying sizes. Uniformity means individual units are interchangeable. $1 bill functions identically to any other dollar bill. Limited supply prevents inflation from eroding value. Acceptability, perhaps most crucial, requires general willingness to accept money in exchange. Legal tender laws help establish acceptability, but ultimately, money functions because people believe others will accept it. Historically, various commodities served as money. Gold and silver predominated due to their durability, divisibility, and limited supply. Cattle, shells, salt, and tobacco all functioned as money in different societies. Commodity money possesses intrinsic value beyond its monetary role. Gold can be fashioned into jewelry, cattle can be eaten or used for labor. Modern economies employ fiat money, currency with no intrinsic value, backed only by government decree and public confidence. A dollar bill costs mere cents to print and has minimal non-monetary value, yet it purchases goods worth $1 because everyone accepts it, expecting others to do likewise. The United States abandoned the gold standard in 1971, severing any link between dollars and precious metals. Most nations followed similar paths, embracing purely fiat currencies. Banks play a central role in modern monetary systems. They accept deposits from savers and make loans to borrowers. This intermediation channels funds from those with surplus resources to those needing capital. However, Banks do more than merely transfer existing money. They create money through the lending process. Fractional reserve banking enables this money creation. Banks hold only a fraction of deposits as reserves, lending the remainder. Consider a simplified example. Sarah deposits $1,000 in cash at Bank A. The bank must hold reserves, funds available to meet withdrawal demands. Suppose the reserve requirement is 10%. Bank A keeps $100 in reserves and loans $900 to Tom. Tom uses the loan to purchase equipment from Jennifer. Jennifer deposits Tom's $900 check at Bank B. Bank B now holds $900 in new deposits, keeps $90 as required reserves, and loans $810 to Michael. This process continues through the banking system. The initial $1,000 deposit supported $1,000 in Sarah's account, $900 in Jennifer's account, $810 in Michael's account, and subsequent deposits created through further lending. The money supply has expanded far beyond the original $1,000 in currency. The money multiplier quantifies this expansion. With a 10% reserve requirement, the multiplier equals 10. $1,000 in new reserves supports $10,000 in deposits. The formula expresses the multiplier as 1 divided by the reserve requirement. Lower reserve requirements produce larger multipliers. A 5% requirement yields a multiplier of 20. Higher requirements constrain money creation. A 20% requirement limits the multiplier to 5. This process operates in reverse when the money supply contracts. If Sarah withdraws her original deposit, Bank A must call in loans or sell assets to obtain funds. This reduces lending, which reduces deposits elsewhere, which constrains additional lending. The contraction multiplies through the system, just as expansion did. Reserve requirements serve as one tool for controlling money supply. Increasing requirements limits lending and money creation. Decreasing requirements encourages expansion. Banks also hold excess reserves beyond legal minimums, particularly during financial uncertainty. These precautionary holdings reduce the effective multiplier below its theoretical maximum. Through this mechanism, banks multiply the money supply considerably beyond physical currency in circulation. A deposit of $1,000 with a 10% reserve requirement ultimately supports $10,000 in deposits throughout the banking system. This amplification makes monetary policy powerful as changes in base money ripple through the economy with multiplied effect. The institution responsible for managing base money and influencing broader monetary aggregates is the central bank. In the United States, the Federal Reserve System performs this role, wielding substantial influence over economic activity through its policy decisions. Central banks occupy a unique position in modern economies. Unlike commercial banks which pursue profits through lending and deposit taking, central banks serve public policy objectives. The Federal Reserve, established in 1913 following a series of financial panics, manages the United States money supply, supervises commercial banks, and acts as lender of last resort during financial crises. 12 regional Federal Reserve banks operate under the Board of Governors in Washington, with the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, directing monetary policy. The Federal Reserve operates under a dual mandate established by Congress. Maximum employment and stable prices constitute the two objectives, though these goals sometimes conflict. Stimulating employment may accelerate inflation, restraining inflation may increase unemployment. The Fed must balance these competing aims, adjusting policy as economic conditions evolve. 3 main tools enable monetary policy implementation: open market operations. The purchase and sale of government securities represent the most frequently used instrument. When the Fed purchases Treasury securities from banks, it credits their reserve accounts, increasing reserves in the banking system. Banks with excess reserves expand lending, multiplying the money supply through the fractional reserve process. When the Fed sells securities, it debits bank reserves, contracting the monetary base and constraining lending. These operations target the federal funds rate, the interest rate banks charge each other for overnight loans of reserves. The Fed announces a target range for this rate and conducts open market operations to keep the actual rate within that range. Changes in the federal funds rate ripple through the economy, affecting other interest rates, including mortgage rates, corporate bond yields, and consumer loan rates. Lower federal funds rates encourage borrowing and spending. Higher rates discourage them. The discount rate, the interest rate the Fed charges commercial banks for direct loans, provides the second policy tool. Banks typically borrow from each other rather than from the Fed, viewing discount window borrowing as a signal of financial weakness. Nevertheless, the discount rate serves as a ceiling for the federal funds rate. Banks would not pay more to borrow from each other than they could borrow from the Fed. During financial crises, the discount window provides emergency liquidity to banks unable to obtain funds through normal channels. Reserve requirements, the third traditional tool, specify the minimum percentage of deposits banks must hold as reserves. Raising reserve requirements forces banks to hold more reserves and lend less, contracting the money supply. Lowering requirements allows increased lending and money expansion. The Fed has used this tool sparingly in recent decades, preferring the more flexible open market operations. In 2020, reserve requirements were reduced to zero, eliminating this tool temporarily. Monetary policy operates through several transmission channels. The interest rate channel works most directly. Lower rates reduce borrowing costs, encouraging business investment in equipment and structures, as well as household purchases of homes and durable goods. Higher rates increase borrowing costs, discouraging such spending. The credit channel operates through bank lending standards. Expansionary policy improves bank balance sheets and encourages lending. Contractionary policy constrains credit availability beyond simple interest rate effects. Asset price channels matter increasingly in modern economies. Lower interest rates boost stock prices and real estate values as investors seek returns and future profits are discounted at lower rates. Higher asset values create wealth effects, encouraging consumption. Higher interest rates produce opposite effects. Exchange rate channels operate through international capital flows. Higher domestic interest rates attract foreign investment, appreciating the currency and making exports more expensive, while imports become cheaper. Lower rates produce the opposite currency movements. Expansionary monetary policy lowers interest rates to stimulate economic activity during recessions. The Fed purchases securities, increasing reserves and encouraging lending. Banks expand loans to businesses and consumers. Investment and consumption rise. Employment increases. Contractionary monetary policy raises interest rates to cool inflationary pressures during booms. The Fed sells securities, reducing reserves and constraining lending. Higher borrowing costs discourage spending. Economic activity moderates. The 2008 financial crisis prompted unconventional policy measures. With interest rates near zero, the Fed employed quantitative easing, purchasing long-term government bonds and mortgage-backed securities to inject reserves and lower long-term interest rates. Between 2008 and 2014, the Fed's balance sheet expanded from under $1 trillion to over $4 trillion. These purchases aim to stimulate borrowing and spending when traditional interest rate cuts reach their limits. The 2020 pandemic recession triggered similar responses. The Fed reduced interest rates to near zero within weeks and launched massive asset purchases. The balance sheet expanded to over $8 trillion. These actions provided liquidity during market disruptions and supported economic activity during lockdowns. Central bank independence from political interference has become a widely accepted principle, though the degree varies across countries. The Federal Reserve operates with considerable autonomy. Board members serve 14-year terms, insulating them from electoral pressures. The President appoints the Chair and Vice Chair, subject to Senate confirmation, but cannot remove them for policy disagreements. This independence allows the Fed to pursue unpopular but necessary policies, raising interest rates despite political opposition when inflation threatens. The European Central Bank, established in 1998, manages monetary policy for the Eurozone. The Bank of Japan has maintained near-zero interest rates for decades, attempting to combat deflation and stimulate growth. The Bank of England, one of the world's oldest central banks dating to 1694, gained operational independence in 1997. Central banking institutions and practices vary, but the core functions of managing money supply and maintaining financial stability remain consistent across nations. Through these tools and transmission mechanisms, central banks influence the entire economy's liquidity and credit conditions. Lowering interest rates encourages borrowing and spending, stimulating economic expansion. Raising rates discourages borrowing, cooling inflationary pressures, and preventing economic overheating. However, monetary policy operates with significant lags. Actions taken today affect the economy months or years later, as changes in interest rates gradually alter borrowing decisions, which slowly modify spending patterns, which eventually impact employment and inflation. This requires central bankers to anticipate future conditions rather than merely respond to current data, a task fraught with uncertainty, given the economy's complexity and the unpredictability of external shocks. While central banks manage monetary policy through interest rates and money supply, governments employ fiscal policy through taxation and spending decisions, a second major policy domain affecting aggregate economic outcomes. Fiscal policy, the government's use of taxation and spending to influence economic conditions, represents the second major policy lever alongside monetary policy. While central banks adjust interest rates and money supply, governments directly affect aggregate demand through purchases of goods and services and through transfer payments that redistribute income. These fiscal tools can stimulate economic activity during recessions or restrain growth during inflationary periods, though political constraints often limit their deployment. Government spending divides into three broad categories. Government purchases include spending on goods and services, from military equipment to highway construction to public employee salaries. These expenditures directly absorb resources and contribute to aggregate demand. Transfer payments redistribute income through programs including Social Security, Medicare, unemployment insurance, and food assistance. These payments do not purchase output directly, but affect consumption by recipients. Interest payments on government debt represent the third category, compensating bondholders for lending to the government. In the United States, federal spending exceeds $6 trillion annually. Major components include Social Security at roughly $1.2 trillion, Medicare and Medicaid, combined approaching $1.5 trillion, defense spending near $800 billion, and interest on debt around $600 billion. State and local governments add several trillion more in spending, primarily on education, public safety, and infrastructure. Revenue comes predominantly from taxation. The federal government relies on individual income taxes for roughly half its revenue, payroll taxes for Social Security and Medicare contributing about 1/3, and corporate income taxes providing less than 10%. State and local governments depend heavily on sales taxes and property taxes. Excise taxes on specific goods, estate taxes, and various fees provide additional revenue. Tax systems vary in their distributional effects. Progressive taxation imposes higher rates on higher incomes, as with the federal income tax where rates range from 10% on low incomes. to 37% on the highest brackets. Proportional or flat taxation applies the same rate regardless of income level. Regressive taxation takes a larger percentage from lower incomes than higher incomes. Sales taxes exhibit regressivity because lower income households spend larger fractions of their income on consumption. Some fiscal mechanisms operate automatically without requiring new legislation. These automatic stabilizers moderate economic fluctuations by expanding government spending or reducing taxes during recessions while doing the opposite during booms. Unemployment insurance provides the clearest example. During recessions, job losses increase unemployment benefit payments automatically, supporting income and consumption for affected workers. During expansions, employment rises and benefit payments decline. Progressive income taxation also stabilizes automatically. As incomes fall during recessions, many taxpayers drop into lower brackets, reducing their tax burden and leaving more income available for spending. Rising incomes during booms push taxpayers into higher brackets, withdrawing more purchasing power. Discretionary fiscal policy involves deliberate changes in spending or taxes responding to economic conditions. Expansionary fiscal policy combats recessions through increased government spending, reduced taxes, or both. The additional spending or tax cuts boost aggregate demand, encouraging production and employment. The 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act exemplified this approach, providing roughly $800 billion in spending increases and tax cuts following the 2008 financial crisis. The 2020 Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, CARES Act, injected over $2 trillion through enhanced unemployment benefits, direct payments to households, and support for businesses during pandemic lockdowns. Contractionary fiscal policy reduces aggregate demand through spending cuts or tax increases, typically deployed to combat inflation, though rarely popular politically. Governments more readily expand spending than contract it. Fiscal policy affects the economy through multiple channels. Government purchases directly increase demand for goods and services. Tax cuts leave households and businesses with more disposable income, encouraging consumption and investment. Transfer payment increases support spending by recipients. However, fiscal policy also generates multiplier effects. Initial spending increases ripple through the economy as recipients spend their additional income, creating income for others who spend in turn. The size of this multiplier depends on how much recipients spend versus save. Higher marginal propensities to consume produce larger multipliers. The crowding out effect potentially offsets fiscal stimulus. When government borrowing increases to finance deficits, it may raise interest rates by competing with private borrowers for available funds. Higher interest rates discourage private investment. The fiscal expansion that increased government purchases may reduce private investment by comparable amounts, limiting the net stimulus. Empirical evidence suggests crowding out matters more during full employment than during recessions when idle resources exist. Budget deficits occur when government spending exceeds revenue. Surpluses arise when revenue exceeds spending. The United States has run deficits in most years since 1970, with notable surpluses during the late 1990s. Annual deficits have ranged from near balance to over $3 trillion during the pandemic. These annual deficits accumulate into national debt, the total amount owed to bondholders. US federal debt currently exceeds $31 trillion. Economists typically evaluate debt sustainability using the debt-to-GDP ratio rather than absolute amounts. This ratio indicates debt burden relative to the economy's capacity to service it. Ratios below 60% are generally considered manageable. The US ratio has exceeded 100% in recent years, up from roughly 35% in the 1970s. Japan's ratio exceeds 260%, the highest among developed nations. Greece faced a debt crisis in 2010 when its ratio approached 180%, and investors doubted repayment ability. Debates about appropriate fiscal policy persist. Keynesian economists emphasize using deficits to combat recessions, arguing that insufficient aggregate demand causes unemployment and that government spending can fill the gap. Classical and supply-side economists worry that deficits burden future generations, crowd out private investment, and reduce long-term growth. They prefer balanced budgets and smaller government sectors. Political considerations often dominate purely economic logic. Tax cuts prove popular even during expansions. Spending increases attract constituencies. Deficit reduction faces opposition from those affected by spending cuts or tax increases. The appropriate balance between taxation and spending depends partly on values beyond economic efficiency. Societies emphasizing equality may prefer larger government sectors with extensive redistribution. Those prioritizing individual freedom and market outcomes may favor minimal government intervention. These normative judgments lie outside economics' analytical purview, though economic analysis can clarify the trade-offs each choice involves. Just as individual economies face decisions about resource allocation through fiscal and monetary policy, nations must decide how extensively to engage in international exchange, determining the degree of openness to trade and capital flows. International trade operates on the same fundamental principles as domestic exchange, yet it often provokes greater controversy and political opposition. The logic supporting trade between nations mirrors that supporting trade between individuals. Specialization, according to comparative advantage, increases total output, making both trading partners better off than under self-sufficiency. However, while trade benefits nations in aggregate, it creates winners and losers within each country, generating political resistance that purely domestic trade rarely encounters. David Ricardo formalized the principle of comparative advantage in 1817, demonstrating that nations benefit from trade even when one possesses absolute advantage in producing all goods. Absolute advantage means producing a good with fewer resources than another producer. Comparative advantage, the more subtle concept, means producing a good at lower opportunity cost than another producer. Consider a simplified example involving two countries and two goods. Portugal can produce either 80 units of wine or 90 units of cloth with a given amount of resources. England can produce either 120 units of wine or 100 units of cloth with the same resources. Portugal possesses absolute advantage in wine production, 80 versus 120. Wait, that's incorrect. England produces more wine, 120 versus 80, and more cloth, 100 versus 90. England has absolute advantage in both goods. Reconsidering the example properly, suppose Portugal produces 80 wine or 90 cloth, while England produces 50 wine or 100 cloth. Portugal has absolute advantage in wine. England has absolute advantage in cloth. The opportunity cost of wine in Portugal is 90 divided by 80, or 1.125 cloth. In England, wine's opportunity cost is 100 divided by 50, or 2 cloth. Portugal sacrifices less cloth to produce wine, giving it comparative advantage in wine. England's opportunity cost of cloth is 50 divided by 100, or 3.5 wine. Portugal's opportunity cost of cloth is 80 divided by 90, or 0.889 wine. England sacrifices less wine to produce cloth, giving it comparative advantage in cloth. If both countries specialize according to comparative advantage, Portugal producing wine and England producing cloth, total output increases. They can then trade at any ratio between their opportunity costs, both benefiting from increased consumption possibilities. This principle extends to any number of countries and goods, though the mathematics become more complex. The gains from trade arise through specialization. Resources flow to their most productive uses as measured by opportunity costs. Countries export goods they produce relatively efficiently, and import goods others produce more efficiently. This allows consumption beyond what domestic production alone permits. Trade expands production possibilities, similar to how technological progress or resource increases expand the production possibilities frontier. Terms of trade, the ratio at which goods exchange internationally, determine how gains divide between trading partners. If wine trades for cloth at ratios closer to Portugal's opportunity costs, England captures more gains. If ratios favour Portugal, it benefits more. Bargaining power, market size, and elasticities of supply and demand influence actual terms of trade. Despite these theoretical benefits, nations erect trade barriers, including tariffs, quotas, and subsidies. Tariffs tax imports, raising their prices and protecting domestic producers. Quotas limit import quantities directly. Subsidies support domestic producers, allowing them to compete against more efficient foreign suppliers. These barriers reduce total welfare by distorting resource allocation. Yet they persist for multiple reasons. Arguments for protection include infant industry considerations, national security concerns, and employment preservation. Infant industry protection shields emerging industries from established foreign competitors until they achieve competitive scale and experience. Once mature, the industry presumably no longer requires protection. National security arguments justify domestic production of strategic goods, including defense equipment and energy, despite higher costs. Job preservation appeals politically, as import competition threatens workers in affected industries with unemployment. Economic arguments for free trade emphasize efficiency and consumer welfare. Removing barriers allows resources to flow to most productive uses. Consumers benefit from lower prices and greater variety. Competition spurs innovation and productivity improvements. Historical evidence supports these claims. Countries opening to trade generally experience faster growth than those maintaining protectionist policies. The post-World War II expansion of international trade accompanied unprecedented global prosperity. However, trade creates distributional consequences within each nation. Workers in export industries benefit from expanded markets and higher wages. Workers in import-competing industries face displacement and wage pressure. Capital owners in competitive industries gain. Those in protected sectors lose when barriers fall. Geographic regions specialize differently, with some prospering and others declining. The Rust Belt in the United States experienced manufacturing job losses, partly attributable to trade, particularly with China, while coastal technology hubs thrived. These distributional effects explain political opposition despite aggregate gains. Concentrated losses create vocal constituencies demanding protection. Diffuse benefits spread across millions of consumers who pay slightly lower prices but lack organization or political voice. Tariffs on steel raise steel prices modestly, barely noticed by car buyers. Yet steel tariffs significantly benefit domestic steel producers and their workers, who lobby intensively for protection. The principle of comparative advantage provides powerful justification for open trade. Yet translating theory into policy requires addressing the very real costs borne by those displaced by import competition, a challenge that economic analysis alone cannot resolve. International trade requires mechanisms for exchanging currencies, as buyers and sellers operate in different monetary systems. Exchange rates determining how much one currency costs in terms of another influence trade patterns and macroeconomic conditions. Exchange rates serve as the interface between national monetary systems. When Americans purchase European goods, dollars must convert to euros. When Japanese investors buy US Treasury bonds, yen must become dollars. These conversions occur in foreign exchange markets, where currencies trade 24 hours daily across global financial centers. Daily trading volume exceeds $6 trillion, making foreign exchange the world's largest and most liquid financial market. An exchange rate quotes one currency's price in terms of another. The dollar-euro rate might be 1.10, meaning €1 costs $1.10. Alternatively quoted, $1 costs roughly €0.91. Exchange rate changes affect international competitiveness, inflation, and capital flows. A dollar appreciation, increasing the dollar's value relative to other currencies, makes US exports more expensive for foreign buyers, while making imports cheaper for American consumers. Depreciation produces opposite effects. Exchange rate systems fall into two broad categories. Floating exchange rates adjust continuously based on market supply and demand without government intervention. Most major currencies, including the dollar, euro, yen, and pound, float freely. Fixed exchange rates involve government commitment to maintain specific values, typically by buying or selling currencies to offset market pressures. Some nations peg their currencies to the dollar or euro. Others maintain fixed rates against baskets of currencies. Several factors influence exchange rates under floating systems. Interest rate differentials drive capital flows. Higher US interest rates relative to foreign rates attract foreign investment into dollar-denominated assets, increasing demand for dollars and appreciating the currency. Lower relative rates produce the opposite effect. Inflation differentials matter through purchasing power parity relationships. Countries with higher inflation typically experience currency depreciation as their goods become less competitive internationally. Trade balances affect currency demand. Sustained trade deficits require selling domestic currency to purchase foreign currency for imports, creating depreciation pressure. Economic growth rates influence exchange rates through multiple channels. Strong growth attracts foreign investment, appreciating the currency. However, strong growth may also increase imports faster than exports, creating depreciation pressure. Political stability and property rights protection affect international investors' willingness to hold assets denominated in particular currencies. Speculative activity amplifies these fundamental factors as traders anticipate currency movements and position accordingly. Currency appreciation helps consumers and firms purchasing imports by reducing their cost in domestic currency. A stronger dollar allows Americans to buy European vacations, Japanese electronics, and Chinese manufactured goods more cheaply. However, appreciation hurts exporters by making their goods more expensive for foreign buyers. American manufacturers competing in global markets prefer weaker dollars. Depreciation reverses these effects, benefiting exporters while harming importers and consumers. Fixed exchange rate systems require central banks to defend chosen rates through intervention. If market forces push the currency above the target rate, the central bank sells domestic currency and purchases foreign currency, increasing supply and restraining appreciation. If market pressure pushes the currency below target, the bank purchases domestic currency using foreign exchange reserves, supporting the rate. This intervention continues as long as reserves last. Currency crises erupt when markets doubt a government's ability or willingness to maintain a fixed rate. Speculators sell the currency short, betting on devaluation. The central bank depletes reserves, defending the peg. Eventually, reserves exhaust or political will breaks. The currency devalues sharply. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 demonstrated this dynamic. Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea maintained currency pegs that became unsustainable given capital outflows and speculative attacks. All three eventually floated their currencies after costly interventions failed. Balance of payments accounts track all transactions between a nation and the rest of the world. The current account records trade in goods and services, plus income flows from investments. Trade deficits appear as negative current account balances. The capital account records investment flows, including purchases of stocks, bonds, and direct investment in businesses and real estate. These accounts must balance by identity. Current account deficits require corresponding capital account surpluses. Foreign funds must flow in to finance the excess of imports over exports. The United States has run current account deficits for decades, importing more than it exports. These deficits require foreign investment flows, which have arrived consistently given the dollar's status as global reserve currency and the depth of US financial markets. Whether this pattern can continue indefinitely remains debated. Exchange rate systems involve trade-offs. Floating rates adjust automatically to economic shocks, but create uncertainty for traders and investors. Fixed rates provide stability, but require intervention that may conflict with domestic policy objectives. Most nations today employ floating rates, though emerging market economies more commonly maintain various forms of managed floats or pegs. Within domestic economies, labour markets determine another crucial set of prices and quantities. Wages and employment emerge through interactions between workers supplying labour and firms demanding it, though institutions and market power significantly modify purely competitive outcomes. Labour markets, like product markets, equilibrate supply and demand through price adjustments, though here the price takes the form of wages and the quantity represents employment. However, labour markets differ from commodity markets in fundamental ways that complicate simple supply-demand analysis. Labour remains inseparable from the humans providing it, creating ethical dimensions and social concerns absent from markets for timber or steel. Workers cannot be stored like inventory. Their productivity depends on motivation and morale, factors irrelevant for inanimate goods. Consequently, labour market institutions, including minimum wages, unions, and employment regulations, modify pure market outcomes more extensively than in most product markets. Labour supply reflects workers' decisions about how much time to devote to paid employment versus leisure and household production. Individuals face a trade-off between income and free time. Higher wages make leisure more expensive in terms of foregone earnings, encouraging additional work. This substitution effect typically dominates at low wage levels. However, higher wages also increase income, allowing workers to afford more of all goods, including leisure. This income effect may eventually dominate, causing labour supply to decrease at very high wages. Empirical evidence suggests labour supply curves slope upward for most workers, though they may bend backward at extremely high compensation levels. Labour force participation rates, the percentage of working-age population either employed or actively seeking work, vary considerably across demographic groups and have changed substantially over time. Female labour force participation in the United States rose from roughly 30% in 1950 to nearly 60% currently. Male participation declined slightly from over 80% to around 70% during the same period. These changes reflect shifting social norms, rising real wages, declining fertility, and technological changes affecting household production. Labour demand derives from firms' demand for output. Employers hire workers not for the labour itself, but for the goods and services those workers produce. A firm expands employment as long as the additional revenue from one more worker's output exceeds the cost of employing that worker. This marginal revenue product of labour depends on the worker's productivity and the price of output. More productive workers generate more value. Higher output prices increase the value of any given productivity level. Wage determination in competitive markets follows from these supply and demand forces. Equilibrium wages emerge where the quantity of labour workers supply equals the quantity firms demand. Workers with higher productivity command higher wages. Industries producing more valuable output pay more. Geographic areas with labour shortages experience wage increases that attract workers from elsewhere. Human capital, the accumulated skills and knowledge embodied in workers, substantially affects productivity and wages. Education and training represent investments that enhance earning capacity over working lifetimes. Data consistently show strong positive relationships between education levels and wages. Workers with bachelor's degrees earn roughly 60% more on average than those with only high school diplomas. Advanced degrees produce even larger premiums. These differentials partly reflect actual productivity differences resulting from education. They also reflect signalling, where educational credentials inform employers about worker quality independent of skills learned. Wage differentials arise from multiple sources beyond human capital. Compensating differentials emerge when unpleasant or dangerous jobs require higher pay to attract workers. Commercial fishermen, miners, and loggers earn premiums reflecting workplace hazards. Night shift workers receive higher wages than day shift workers performing identical tasks. Discrimination based on race, gender, or other characteristics produces wage gaps unrelated to productivity. Women earn roughly 83 cents for every dollar men earn, with portions of this gap attributable to occupational choices, experience differences, and work interruptions, though discrimination contributes as well. Minimum wage laws mandate wage floors, preventing employers from paying below specified levels. The federal minimum wage stands at $7.25 per hour, unchanged since 2009. Though many states and cities impose higher minimums. Economic theory predicts that minimum wages above market clearing levels reduce employment by making some workers too expensive to hire profitably. Empirical evidence produces mixed results. Some studies find modest negative employment effects among teenagers and low-skilled workers. Others detect minimal impacts, possibly because monopsony power or efficiency wage considerations offset the predicted disemployment effects. Labour unions engage in collective bargaining, negotiating wages and working conditions on behalf of members. Union membership in the United States peaked above 30% of wage and salaried workers in the 1950s, but has declined to roughly 10% currently. Private sector unionization fell even more dramatically to around 6%. Public sector unions maintain stronger presence at over 30% membership. Unions typically raise wages for members by 10 to 15% compared to similar non-union workers, though these gains may come partly at the expense of reduced employment or slower employment growth. Monopsony, where a single employer dominates a labour market, creates market power, allowing firms to pay wages below competitive levels. Company towns historically exhibited monopsony power. Contemporary examples include rural hospitals employing most local nurses or school districts hiring most local teachers. Under monopsony, minimum wages can increase both wages and employment simultaneously by offsetting employer market power, contrary to competitive market predictions. Income inequality has increased substantially in most developed countries since the 1980s. The Gini coefficient, measuring inequality on a scale from 0, perfect equality, to 1, perfect inequality, rose from roughly 0.35 to 0.48 in the United States during this period. The share of income flowing to the top 1% of earners doubled from 10% to 20%. These trends reflect technological change favoring skilled workers, globalization reducing wages for workers competing with imports, declining unionization, changing social norms around executive compensation, and policy changes including reduced top tax rates. Labour markets involve more than economic efficiency considerations. They intersect with questions of equity, dignity, and social justice. Whether someone can support a family through full-time work carries moral significance beyond market clearing. Consequently, governments intervene extensively through minimum wage laws, occupational licensing, workplace safety regulations, unemployment insurance, and anti-discrimination statutes, reflecting societal values that transcend pure efficiency calculations. The aggregate performance of an economy over time, its growth rate, ultimately depends on accumulating and effectively deploying the labour and other factors these markets organise. Economic growth determines long-run living standards and represents macroeconomic central concern. Economic growth, the sustained increase in real output per capita over time, represents perhaps the most important determinant of living standards. Nations achieving consistent growth escape poverty and provide rising prosperity for their citizens. Those experiencing stagnation remain poor despite years passing. Small differences in annual growth rates compound into enormous disparities across decades. An economy growing at 2% annually doubles output in 35 years. One growing at 4% doubles in 18 years. Over a century, these different growth rates produce outcomes diverging by factors of 7 or more. Growth measurement typically employs real GDP per capita, adjusting for both inflation and population changes. This metric has increased roughly 20-fold in the United States since 1870, reflecting the Industrial Revolution's transformative effects and subsequent technological progress. However, growth rates vary considerably across countries and time periods. China has achieved annual growth exceeding 8% for 4 decades. Many African nations have experienced negligible or negative per capita growth during similar periods. The sources of economic growth include 3 broad categories. Capital accumulation involves increasing the stock of productive equipment, structures, and infrastructure available to workers. Labour force growth expands the number of workers, contributing to production. Technological progress, also termed total factor productivity growth, reflects improvements in knowledge, organisation, and efficiency, allowing more output from given inputs. The production function formalizes these relationships. Output Y depends on capital K, labour L, and total factor productivity A. The simplest formulation expresses output as a function of these inputs. Y equals F of K, L, and A. More sophisticated versions specify particular mathematical forms, including the Cobb-Douglas production function, which assumes constant returns to scale and allows estimation of each input's contribution. Capital accumulation drives growth in developing economies and during early industrialization. Building factories, roads, ports, and power plants dramatically increases productive capacity. Workers equipped with machinery produce far more than those working with hand tools. However, diminishing returns to capital eventually limit this growth source. Adding the first tractor to a farm substantially raises output. Adding the 10th tractor produces smaller gains. Adding the 100th may contribute almost nothing. Each additional unit of capital holding other inputs constant yields progressively smaller output increases. Robert Solow formalized these relationships in growth models, earning him the 1987 Nobel Prize in Economics. The Solow model predicts that economies relying solely on capital accumulation eventually reach steady states where growth ceases. Depreciation of existing capital offsets new investment. Output per worker stabilizes. Only technological progress permits sustained long-run growth by continuously shifting the production function upward. Total factor productivity encompasses everything affecting output beyond measurable increases in capital and labour. Technological innovations, including machinery designs, production processes, and product improvements, all contribute. Organizational changes improving workflow efficiency matter. Better educated and healthier workers produce more output. Improved institutions, including property rights, contract enforcement, and regulatory frameworks, enable more effective resource allocation. Empirical decompositions attribute roughly half of long-run US growth to total factor productivity rather than capital or labor accumulation. Human capital, the skills and knowledge embodied in workers, functions as a form of capital distinct from physical capital. Education and training enhance productivity. Nations with higher average education levels achieve faster growth. The returns to schooling appear substantial both privately and socially. However, distinguishing education's productive effects from its signaling role remains challenging. Institutions and property rights play crucial enabling roles. Secure property rights encourage investment by ensuring owners reap returns. Contract enforcement allows complex transactions and specialization. Competitive markets allocate resources efficiently. Political stability attracts domestic and foreign investment. Corruption and arbitrary regulation discourage entrepreneurship and innovation. Economic historians increasingly emphasize institutional quality as fundamental to growth. Comparing North and South Korea, East and West Germany before reunification, or Hong Kong and mainland China before reforms reveals institutional effects starkly. Identical cultures and similar resource endowments produced vastly different outcomes under different institutional arrangements. Joseph Schumpeter emphasized innovation and creative destruction, the process where new technologies and business models displace established ones. Entrepreneurs introducing innovations reap profits temporarily until competitors imitate successful innovations. This competitive process drives continuous innovation. Established firms facing disruption resist change, but market forces eventually allocate resources to more productive uses. Automobile manufacturers displaced carriage makers, personal computers displaced typewriters. Online retailers challenge traditional retail stores. This churn creates disruption and hardship for displaced workers and obsolete capital, yet it drives long-run productivity growth. The convergence hypothesis predicts poor countries should grow faster than rich ones, narrowing income gaps over time. Diminishing returns imply capital flows to poor countries with lower capital-to-labor ratios should produce higher returns. Poor countries can adopt technologies developed elsewhere, rather than innovating from scratch. Empirical evidence shows conditional convergence. Countries with similar institutions, education levels, and policies tend towards similar income levels, with poor ones growing faster. However, unconditional convergence fails. Many poor countries remain poor, lacking institutional and policy conditions necessary for utilizing their potential advantages. Understanding growth sources matters enormously for policy. If physical capital drives growth, investment subsidies and infrastructure spending merit priority. If human capital dominates, education expenditures deserve emphasis. If institutions matter most, governance reforms become paramount. Contemporary research suggests all three contribute, though institutions and technological progress may ultimately matter more than simple capital accumulation, as the failures of Soviet-style investment-heavy strategies demonstrated. While growth represents the economy's long-term trend, actual output fluctuates around that trend in recurring patterns. Business cycles create alternating periods of expansion and contraction, boom and bust, presenting challenges for stabilization policy. Economies rarely grow smoothly along their long-term trend paths. Instead, output fluctuates in recurring patterns termed business cycles, alternating between periods of expansion when output rises and contractions when output falls. These fluctuations create recurrent challenges for policymakers attempting to maintain stable growth and full employment. Understanding what causes these cycles and whether policy can moderate them remains central to macroeconomic theory and practice. Business cycles consist of 4 distinct phases. Expansion begins from a trough, the lowest point of economic activity, and continues as output, employment, and incomes rise. The expansion eventually reaches a peak, the highest level before downturn begins. Contraction or recession follows as output declines, unemployment rises, and incomes fall. The cycle completes when contraction reaches its trough, establishing the starting point for the next expansion. These phases vary considerably in duration and severity. Expansions typically last several years. Contractions usually prove shorter, averaging roughly 11 months in the United States since World War II, though the 2001 and 2020 recessions lasted only 8 months each. Recession receives formal definition as 2 consecutive quarters of declining real GDP, though the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, which officially dates US business cycles, employs broader criteria, including employment, income, and sales data alongside GDP. Depression represents a severe and prolonged recession, though no precise quantitative threshold distinguishes the two. The Great Depression of the 1930s stands as the only clear modern example, with output falling 30% and unemployment reaching 25%. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply provide the conceptual framework for analyzing fluctuations. Aggregate demand represents total spending on goods and services at various price levels, encompassing consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports. Aggregate supply reflects total output firms produce at various price levels. Short-run aggregate supply slopes upward as higher prices encourage expanded production. Long-run aggregate supply appears vertical at potential output, the economy's productive capacity given available resources and technology. Demand shocks, sudden changes in spending, cause many fluctuations. Consumer confidence collapses trigger spending declines. Stock market crashes reduce wealth and consumption. Banking crises restrict credit. Investment plunges during uncertainty. Government spending cuts reduce demand. These demand contractions shift aggregate demand leftward, reducing output and employment. Positive demand shocks produce expansions through opposite mechanisms. Supply shocks, sudden changes in production costs or capacity, cause other fluctuations. Oil price spikes raise production costs across many industries. Natural disasters destroy productive capacity. Pandemics disrupt supply chains. Poor harvests reduce agricultural output. These adverse supply shocks shift aggregate supply leftward, reducing output while paradoxically raising prices, creating stagflation where recession and inflation occur simultaneously. The 1970s oil shocks exemplified this pattern. Favorable supply shocks, including technological breakthroughs or commodity price declines, shift supply rightward, expanding output and reducing prices. Keynesian economics, developed by John Maynard Keynes during the Great Depression and formalized in his 1936 General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, emphasizes insufficient aggregate demand as the primary cause of recessions. When aggregate demand falls below potential output, unemployment rises. Workers willing to work at prevailing wages cannot find jobs. Capacity sits idle. Keynes argued that market forces might not restore full employment quickly or automatically. As classical economics suggested, wages and prices adjust slowly downward. Expectations and animal spirits, business people's psychological attitudes about future prospects, create self-fulfilling patterns. Pessimism reduces investment. Reduced investment lowers income. Lower income justifies pessimism. The multiplier effect amplifies initial spending changes. When government spending increases by $1, recipients spend a portion, creating income for others who spend in turn. The total output increase exceeds the initial spending increase. The multiplier equals 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. If people spend 75 cents of each additional dollar earned, the multiplier equals 4. $1 of government spending ultimately generates $4 of additional output. Keynesian policy prescriptions emphasize activist stabilization through fiscal and monetary expansion during recessions. Government spending increases or tax cuts boost demand directly. Monetary policy lowers interest rates, encouraging private spending. These interventions can restore full employment faster than market adjustment alone. The 2009 fiscal stimulus and Federal Reserve interest rate cuts reflected Keynesian thinking applied to the 2008 financial crisis. Classical and monetarist economists offer alternative explanations. Classical theory emphasizes monetary instability rather than real demand failures. Milton Friedman argued that the Great Depression resulted from Federal Reserve policy failures, allowing the money supply to collapse by 1/3 between 1929 and 1933. Preventing such monetary contractions would prevent severe recessions. Monetary policy should focus on maintaining stable money growth rather than fine-tuning the economy. Friedman's research, recognized with the 1976 Nobel Prize, influenced central banking practices worldwide. Real business cycle theory attributes fluctuations to technology shocks affecting productivity rather than aggregate demand fluctuations. According to this view, recessions may represent optimal responses to negative productivity shocks. Forcing workers into employment when productivity has temporarily fallen would be inefficient. The theory downplays the need for stabilization policy, arguing that cycles reflect efficient adjustments to real changes. However, this explanation struggles to account for severe downturns like the Great Depression or 2008 financial crisis, where technological regress seems implausible. The Great Depression remains the most studied economic contraction. Between 1929 and 1933, US real GDP fell approximately 30%. Unemployment rose from 3% to 25%. Stock prices collapsed 89% from peak to trough. Banks failed by thousands. International trade contracted sharply as nations raised tariffs. Recovery proved slow and incomplete until World War II mobilization finally restored full employment. The causes remain debated. Monetary contraction, banking failures, international gold standard constraints, fiscal austerity, and protectionist trade policies all contributed. The Depression discredited laissez-faire economics and motivated Keynesian theory and activist government economic management. The 2008 financial crisis originated in housing market speculation and financial innovation, including mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations. When housing prices peaked and began falling in 2006, mortgage defaults surged. Financial institutions holding mortgage-related securities suffered losses. Credit markets froze as banks became unwilling to lend, uncertain about counterparty solvency. Lehman Brothers collapsed in September 2008. The crisis spread globally through interconnected financial markets. GDP fell roughly 4%. Unemployment rose from 5% to 10%. Governments responded with massive fiscal stimulus. Central banks reduced interest rates to near zero and employed quantitative easing. Recovery proved slow, with unemployment remaining elevated for years. The 2020 pandemic recession differed from typical demand-driven downturns. Government-mandated shutdowns to contain COVID-19 directly restricted economic activity. Output fell 11% in a single quarter, the sharpest drop on record. Unemployment spiked to nearly 15% as businesses closed temporarily or permanently. However, massive fiscal support, including enhanced unemployment benefits, direct household payments, and business loans, limited income declines. Monetary policy again employed zero interest rates and quantitative easing. Recovery began quickly as restrictions eased, though supply chain disruptions and labour shortages complicated the rebound. Explaining business cycles remains contentious. The Keynesian emphasis on demand management dominated policy from the 1940s through 1970s. Monetarist critiques gained influence subsequently. Real business cycle theory offered market-clearing alternatives to demand failure explanations. Contemporary macroeconomics attempts synthesis, recognizing that different recessions may have different causes, requiring different policy responses. While macroeconomics examines these aggregate fluctuations, microeconomics investigates the decision-making of individual consumers and producers whose choices aggregate into market outcomes and ultimately drive the macroeconomic patterns observed. Microeconomics examines the behavior of individual economic agents, consumers purchasing goods and firms producing them. These agents face constraints and make choices attempting to achieve objectives. Consumers seek to maximize utility, the satisfaction or well-being derived from consumption. Producers seek to maximize profit, the difference between revenue earned from sales and costs incurred in production. Understanding these optimization problems explains why demand curves slope downward, why supply curves slope upward, and how individual decisions aggregate into market outcomes. Utility theory formalizes consumer preferences. Utility represents satisfaction, though economists treat it as an ordinal concept rather than cardinal measurement. That is, consumers can rank alternatives as better or worse, but cannot meaningfully quantify how much better. A consumer might prefer apples to oranges without specifying that apples provide exactly 1.7 times the utility of oranges. Indifference curves graphically represent combinations of goods yielding equal utility. A consumer feels equally satisfied consuming 5 apples and 2 oranges, or 3 apples and 4 oranges, if both combinations lie on the same indifference curve. The principle of diminishing marginal utility explains much consumer behavior. The first unit of consumption typically yields high satisfaction. Successive units provide progressively less additional utility. The first slice of pizza satisfies intense hunger. The second tastes good, but provides less incremental satisfaction. The third may be consumed more from habit than hunger. The 10th would likely reduce utility rather than increase it. This declining marginal utility explains why consumers diversify purchases rather than spending all income on a single good. Budget constraints limit consumption possibilities. Income restricts total spending. The budget line shows all affordable combinations of 2 goods given their prices and available income. A consumer with $100 can buy 10 units of a good priced at $10 or 20 units of a good priced at $5 or various combinations. Higher income shifts the budget line outward. Price changes rotate it. Optimal consumption occurs where the budget line touches the highest attainable indifference curve. At this tangency point, the rate at which the consumer is willing to trade one good for another, the marginal rate of substitution, equals the rate at which the market allows such trades through relative prices. The consumer allocates income such that the marginal utility per dollar spent equals across all goods. Spending an additional dollar on any good yields the same utility gain as spending that dollar on any other good. This equality ensures no reallocation could increase total utility. Consumer surplus measures welfare gained from market participation. It represents the difference between what consumers would be willing to pay for goods and what they actually pay. Graphically, consumer surplus appears as the area below the demand curve and above the market price. This surplus quantifies the net benefit consumers receive from trade, providing a metric for evaluating policy changes and market efficiency. Production theory analyzes firms' decisions about output levels. Firms combine inputs including labor, capital, and materials to produce goods and services. The short run defines a period where some inputs remain fixed, typically capital stock. Firms can adjust variable inputs, like labour and materials, but cannot quickly alter factory size or equipment. The long run allows adjustment of all inputs. Production costs divide into fixed and variable categories. Fixed costs, including rent, insurance, and salaried management, remain constant regardless of output level. Variable costs, including hourly wages, raw materials, and energy, fluctuate with production. Total cost equals fixed cost plus variable cost. Average cost equals total cost divided by quantity. Marginal cost, the additional cost of producing one more unit, typically rises as output expands due to diminishing returns to variable inputs. Marginal revenue, the additional revenue from selling one more unit, depends on market structure. Under perfect competition, firms accept market price as given. Marginal revenue equals price. Under imperfect competition, including monopoly and monopolistic competition, firms face downward sloping demand curves. Selling additional units requires accepting lower prices. Marginal revenue falls below price. Profit maximization requires producing where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Producing beyond this point means additional units cost more to make than they generate in revenue, reducing profit. Producing below this point leaves profitable opportunities unexploited. The equality of marginal revenue and marginal cost determines optimal output for any firm regardless of market structure, though the actual profit level varies with competitive conditions. Producer surplus, analogous to consumer surplus, measures welfare gained by sellers. It represents the difference between market price and the minimum price sellers would accept, which equals marginal cost. Graphically, producer surplus appears as the area above the supply curve and below market price. This surplus quantifies net benefit producers receive from trade. Competitive markets maximize total surplus, the sum of consumer and producer surplus. No reallocation could increase combined welfare. Price equals marginal cost, ensuring efficient resource allocation. Units are produced if, and only if, marginal benefit exceeds marginal cost. This efficiency provides the theoretical justification for market allocation, though various market failures can undermine this result. These microeconomic foundations explain the supply and demand curves introduced earlier. Consumers maximize utility subject to budget constraints, generating demand curves. As price falls, the optimal consumption point moves along the budget line to higher quantities. Aggregating across consumers produces the market demand curve. Producers maximize profit by equating marginal revenue and marginal cost, generating supply curves. As price rises, the profit-maximizing output level increases. Aggregating across firms produces the market supply curve. The intersection of these aggregated curves determines market equilibrium, price and quantity, coordinating millions of individual optimization decisions into coherent market outcomes without requiring central direction or comprehensive planning. Beyond simple optimization, economic agents frequently interact strategically, where one party's optimal choice depends on others' choices. Game theory formalizes this interdependence and reveals insights about cooperation, conflict, and equilibrium in strategic settings. Game theory, developed initially by mathematicians in the mid-20th century, has become an essential tool for analyzing strategic interactions in economics. It examines situations where outcomes depend not only on one's own choices, but also on choices made by others. Such interdependence pervades economic life. Oligopolistic firms setting prices must anticipate competitors' responses. Workers negotiating wages consider employers' alternatives. Nations negotiating trade agreements predict partners' concessions and demands. Game theory formalizes this strategic reasoning, revealing patterns and equilibria that intuition might miss. A game consists of three elements. Players are the decision makers, whether individuals, firms, or governments. Strategies represent the available choices each player faces. Payoffs indicate outcomes resulting from various strategy combinations, typically measured in utility or profit. Games may be simultaneous, with players choosing without knowing others' choices, or sequential, where some players move after observing others' actions. The prisoner's dilemma illustrates game theory's insights and challenges. Two suspects face interrogation in separate rooms. Each can either confess or remain silent. If both remain silent, police can convict them only of minor charges, resulting in 1 year imprisonment each. If one confesses while the other remains silent, the confessor goes free while the silent prisoner receives 10 years. If both confess, each receives 5 years. The payoff structure creates a dilemma. Each prisoner's optimal choice, regardless of the other's action, involves confessing. If the partner remains silent, confessing yields freedom rather than 1 year. If the partner confesses, confessing yields 5 years rather than 10. Confession dominates silence as a strategy. Yet both prisoners confessing produces worse outcomes for both, 5 years each, than if both had remained silent, 1 year each. Individual rationality produces collective irrationality. This structure explains numerous economic and social problems. Firms would profit more through collusion, maintaining high prices. Yet each firm benefits from undercutting competitors, regardless of whether others maintain agreed prices. Nations would benefit from environmental cooperation, yet each nation gains from free riding, while others reduce emissions. Arms races continue because neither side dares disarm unilaterally. A dominant strategy provides the best choice, regardless of others' actions. In the prisoner's dilemma, confession dominates for both players. When a dominant strategy exists, rational players choose it. However, many games lack dominant strategies, requiring consideration of what others will likely do. Nash equilibrium, named for mathematician John Nash, who formalized the concept and received the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1994, represents a set of strategies where no player can improve outcomes through unilateral deviation. Each player's strategy is optimal given others' strategies. In the prisoner's dilemma, both confessing constitutes Nash equilibrium. Neither prisoner improves their situation by switching to silence while the other confesses. Nash equilibrium does not imply optimal outcomes. The prisoner's dilemma's equilibrium produces 5 years imprisonment, each worse than the 1 year each could achieve through mutual silence. However, mutual silence is not a Nash equilibrium because each player has incentive to deviate. This distinction between individual incentives and collective welfare pervades strategic settings. Applications to oligopoly reveal game theory's practical value. Consider two firms, Firm A and Firm B, choosing prices. High prices benefit both if maintained jointly. However, each firm can capture market share by undercutting the competitor. The payoff structure resembles the prisoner's dilemma. Both choosing low prices constitutes Nash equilibrium, despite producing lower profits than collusion would generate. Sequential games introduce additional strategic considerations. First movers may gain advantages through commitment. A firm entering a market first might invest heavily in capacity, deterring later entrants who recognize that competing would drive prices below profitable levels. Alternatively, moving second allows learning from others' mistakes. Game trees represent sequential games, showing decision points and payoffs at terminal nodes. Repeated games change incentives substantially. When the prisoner's dilemma repeats indefinitely, cooperation becomes sustainable through reciprocal strategies. A player might cooperate initially and continue cooperating as long as the partner cooperates, but retaliate against defection. The threat of future punishment sustains cooperation that would collapse in single-shot games. This explains how firms maintain tacit collusion without explicit agreements. Each Firm maintains high prices, anticipating that undercutting would trigger destructive price wars. Auction theory, another game theory application, analyzes bidding strategies in various auction formats. The Federal Communications Commission employs game theory insights when designing spectrum auctions, raising billions of dollars while efficiently allocating radio frequencies. Companies use game theory to design strategic bidding in procurement and sales contexts. Coordination games present multiple Nash equilibria without clear focal points. Consider two firms choosing between competing technology standards. Both prefer adopting the same standard, but may disagree about which. Multiple equilibria exist where both choose the same option, yet reaching agreement without communication proves difficult. Network effects and first-mover advantages often determine which equilibrium emerges. Game theory reveals why purely self-interested behavior sometimes produces collectively suboptimal outcomes. The prisoner's dilemma shows individual rationality leading to mutual defection even when cooperation benefits both parties. This insight helps explain difficulties in achieving international environmental agreements, arms control treaties, and other collective action problems where enforcement mechanisms remain weak or absent. These collective action failures represent one category of market failure, situations where unregulated markets fail to allocate resources efficiently. Understanding various market failure types justifies potential government intervention in otherwise market-based economies. Markets often allocate resources efficiently, channeling inputs toward most valued uses and rewarding productive contributions. However, several conditions must hold for this efficiency to obtain. When these conditions fail, markets produce suboptimal outcomes even when functioning competitively. Such market failures provide the primary economic justification for government intervention in otherwise market-based systems. Externalities, costs or benefits imposed on third parties not involved in a transaction, represent perhaps the most common market failure. Negative externalities occur when production or consumption harms others without compensation. A factory emitting air pollution imposes health costs on nearby residents. Drivers creating traffic congestion slow other commuters. Secondhand smoke affects non-smokers. In each case, decision-makers ignore costs borne by others, leading to excessive production or consumption of the harmful activity. The socially optimal level lies below the market equilibrium level. Positive externalities arise when activities benefit third parties without compensation. Education benefits students directly, but also creates broader social gains through reduced crime, informed citizenship, and productivity spillovers. Vaccination protects the vaccinated individual while also reducing disease transmission to others. Basic research generates knowledge available to many innovators. These activities occur at levels below social optimum because private decision-makers capture only their direct benefits, ignoring advantages flowing to others. The Coase theorem, developed by Ronald Coase, who received the Nobel Prize in 1991, demonstrates that private bargaining can resolve externality problems when transaction costs are low and property rights are well defined. If a factory's pollution harms nearby residents, the parties might negotiate an efficient outcome regardless of whether the factory has the right to pollute or residents have the right to clean air. With low bargaining costs, the party valuing the outcome most will purchase the right from the other. However, transaction costs often prove prohibitive. Thousands of people affected by pollution cannot easily negotiate with polluters. Information asymmetries and strategic behavior complicate bargaining. Arthur Pigou proposed corrective taxes and subsidies, named Pigouvian policies in his honor. A tax equal to marginal external cost forces polluters to internalize the harm they cause, aligning private and social costs. Carbon taxes exemplify this approach. pricing greenhouse gas emissions to reflect climate damage. Several European nations and Canadian provinces have implemented carbon taxes, with rates ranging from $10 to over $100 per tonne of carbon dioxide. Subsidies for positive externalities, including education subsidies and research grants, encourage activities generating social benefits beyond private returns. Public goods characterized by non-rivalry and non-excludability create another market failure category. Non-rivalry means one person's consumption does not reduce availability for others. A lighthouse guides multiple ships simultaneously. National defense protects all citizens regardless of individual consumption levels. Non-excludability prevents charging users or preventing non-payers from benefiting. Anyone near the lighthouse benefits whether or not they contributed to construction costs. The free rider problem undermines private provision of public goods. Rational individuals wait for others to pay, hoping to enjoy benefits without bearing costs. If everyone free rides, no one provides the good despite widespread willingness to pay collectively. National defense, basic research, lighthouses, and clean air exemplify public goods unlikely to be provided adequately without government intervention. Governments finance such goods through compulsory taxation, overcoming the free rider problem by forcing contributions. Asymmetric information, where one party knows more than another, creates additional market failures. Adverse selection occurs when hidden information leads to market unraveling. George Akerlof demonstrated this mechanism in used car markets, work recognized with the Nobel Prize in 2001. Sellers know car quality better than buyers. Buyers, unable to distinguish good cars from lemons, offer prices reflecting average quality. Owners of good cars refuse to sell at these prices. Only lemon owners accept. The market fills with low-quality cars, and buyers rationally lower offers further. High-quality cars exit the market entirely. Insurance markets face similar problems. People know their health status better than insurers. High-risk individuals eagerly purchase insurance. Low-risk individuals avoid it at prices reflecting average risk. The insured pool skews toward high risk, forcing premium increases that drive out more low-risk individuals. Markets may collapse or cover only extreme risks. Mandatory insurance, including requirements in the Affordable Care Act, addresses adverse selection by forcing participation across risk levels. Moral hazard arises when insurance or protection changes behavior, increasing risk. Insured drivers may exercise less caution than uninsured ones. Deposit insurance, while preventing bank runs, encourages banks to take excessive risks, knowing depositors are protected. Workers may shirk when employers cannot monitor effort closely. These behavior changes impose costs on insurers or principals who cannot perfectly observe or control actions. Signaling and screening offer partial solutions to information problems. Education signals ability to employers who cannot directly observe productivity. High-ability workers invest in education because they complete it more easily, separating themselves from low-ability workers who find education too costly. Employers screen applicants through interviews and testing, attempting to reveal hidden information. However, these mechanisms remain imperfect and costly. Common resources, rival but non-excludable goods, suffer from tragedy of the commons, a concept Garrett Hardin formalized in 1968. Ocean fisheries, grazing lands, and atmosphere exemplify commons. Each user captures full benefits of exploitation, while bearing only a fraction of depletion costs. Rational individuals overuse the resource, depleting it despite collective interest in conservation. Solutions include privatization, assigning property rights that internalize costs, or government regulation limiting access. Market failures provide justification for intervention, but do not guarantee that government can improve outcomes. Government failure, where political processes produce inefficient results, must be weighed against market failure. Politicians may pursue re-election rather than efficiency. Special interests may capture regulatory processes. Bureaucracies may lack incentives for cost control. Information problems plague governments as well as markets. Optimal policy requires comparing imperfect markets against imperfect governments, recognizing that identifying market failure represents necessary but insufficient grounds for intervention. Traditional economic theory assumes rational actors maximizing well-defined objectives with stable preferences. However, psychological research reveals systematic departures from these assumptions, leading to the development of behavioral economics and suggesting alternative approaches to both understanding behavior and designing policy. Behavioral economics challenges traditional assumptions about human rationality and decision-making. Standard economic theory models individuals as rational optimizers with stable preferences, perfect self-control, and consistent application of logical principles. Psychological evidence, however, reveals systematic biases and heuristics that produce predictable departures from rational choice. These deviations from traditional models have important implications for understanding actual behavior and designing policies that account for human psychology rather than idealized rationality. Herbert Simon introduced the concept of bounded rationality in the 1950s, work recognized with the Nobel Prize in 1978. Simon argued that humans satisfice rather than optimize, seeking satisfactory solutions rather than perfect ones, given cognitive limitations and information costs. Decision-makers employ mental shortcuts that work reasonably well in most contexts but lead to systematic errors in others. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky developed much of modern behavioral economics through research demonstrating how heuristics generate biases. Kahneman received the Nobel Prize in 2002 for this work, Tversky having died before the award. Their prospect theory revolutionized understanding of decision-making under risk and uncertainty. Loss aversion, perhaps the most robust behavioral finding, indicates that losses hurt approximately twice as much as equivalent gains provide pleasure. People strongly prefer avoiding losses over acquiring gains of equal magnitude. This asymmetry explains why individuals hold losing investments too long, hoping to avoid realizing losses, while selling winners too quickly to lock in gains. It explains why workers resist wage cuts more strongly than they value equivalent raises. It shapes negotiation strategies and consumer behavior broadly. Reference dependence means outcomes are evaluated relative to reference points rather than absolute levels. Whether a change appears as a gain or loss depends on the starting point. This contrasts with standard theory, where only final wealth levels matter. An investor might feel disappointed earning 5% returns if expecting 10%, yet satisfied with 5% if expecting 0. Identical outcomes generate different utility depending on expectations. Framing effects demonstrate that presentation influences choices. Describing a medical treatment as having a 90% survival rate produces more acceptance than describing it as having a 10% mortality rate, despite identical information content. Consumers respond differently to discounts framed as savings versus surcharges framed as penalties. These effects violate standard theory's assumption that preferences depend only on actual outcomes, not descriptions. Present bias and hyperbolic discounting describe tendencies to overweight immediate gratification relative to future consequences. Standard exponential discounting assumes consistent preferences across time. Behavioral evidence shows that people exhibit time inconsistency, preferring $100 today over $110 tomorrow, yet preferring $110 in a year and a day over $100 in a year. This inconsistency explains procrastination, insufficient saving, and failure to follow through on long-term plans. Overconfidence appears broadly across domains. People overestimate their knowledge, abilities, and control over events. Most drivers rate themselves above average. Entrepreneurs underestimate failure probabilities. Investors trade too frequently, convinced they can beat markets despite evidence that trading reduces returns. This overconfidence leads to excessive risk-taking and insufficient preparation for adverse outcomes. Status quo bias and endowment effects create inertia. People disproportionately prefer current arrangements over changes, even when changes would benefit them. Employees stick with default retirement plan options regardless of appropriateness. Consumers renew magazine subscriptions they no longer read. The endowment effect means that owning something increases its perceived value beyond what one would pay to acquire it. Coffee mug owners demand higher selling prices than buyers offer, creating gaps that prevent mutually beneficial trades. Mental accounting describes how people categorize money differently based on its source or intended use, violating fungibility. A found $20 bill may be spent frivolously while earned wages are saved diligently. People maintain savings accounts, earning low interest while carrying credit card debt at high interest rates. Bonuses are spent differently than regular salary, despite money being perfectly substitutable in standard theory. Richard Thaler developed nudge theory, work recognized with the Nobel Prize in 2017, proposing policies that steer people toward better choices while preserving freedom. Libertarian paternalism acknowledges that choice architecture, how options are presented, inevitably influences decisions. Thoughtful design can help people achieve their own goals without mandating particular choices. Default options powerfully shape behavior given status quo bias. Automatic enrollment in retirement savings plans dramatically increases participation compared to requiring active enrollment. Opt-out organ donation systems generate far higher donation rates than opt-in systems. These interventions change defaults while preserving individual freedom to choose otherwise. Applications of behavioral insights span numerous domains. Retirement savings plans now commonly enroll workers automatically at default contribution rates that escalate over time. Energy bills compare household consumption to neighbours, leveraging social comparison to encourage conservation. Commitments devices help people follow through on intentions, as when websites allow users to block distracting sites during work hours, or when savings accounts penalise early withdrawals. Behavioral economics does not reject traditional economics, but enriches it by incorporating psychological realism. The insights generate practical applications in policy design, particularly in creating choice architectures that help individuals achieve their own stated goals. However, ethical concerns arise about manipulation versus assistance in decision-making. When does helping people make better choices, according to their own values, shade into paternalism, imposing others' values? These questions require careful consideration about appropriate boundaries for behavioral interventions. While developed economies grapple with these subtle refinements in understanding economic behavior, much of the world faces more fundamental challenges. Development economics examines why vast disparities in living standards persist and what interventions might accelerate progress in poor nations. The distribution of global income reveals stark disparities that have persisted despite decades of development efforts. Per capita income in Luxembourg exceeds $130,000. In Burundi, it remains below $300. Such gaps, factors of several hundred, dwarf income differences within developed nations. Development economics investigates these differences, seeking to understand why some countries achieve sustained growth while others stagnate in poverty, and what policies might accelerate progress for the world's poorest populations. Measuring development extends beyond simple income comparisons. The Human Development Index, HDI, combines income with life expectancy and education, recognizing that development encompasses more than material consumption. Norway, Switzerland, and Ireland rank highest on this composite measure. Niger, Central African Republic, and South Sudan rank lowest. The World Bank defines extreme poverty as living on less than $2.15 per day, adjusted for purchasing power. Roughly 700 million people, nearly 10% of global population, subsist below this threshold, down from 40% in 1990. Poverty traps represent vicious cycles, preventing escape from destitution. Poor nutrition reduces worker productivity. Low productivity generates low incomes. Low incomes prevent purchasing adequate nutrition. The cycle perpetuates. Similar traps operate through health, education, and infrastructure. Sick children miss school, reducing human capital accumulation. Uneducated adults earn low wages. Low tax revenues prevent health and education investments. Poor infrastructure raises transport costs, limiting market access and discouraging investment. These reinforcing mechanisms keep poor countries poor despite strong desires for improvement. Institutions and governance quality increasingly appear central to development. Success or failure. Property rights security encourages investment. Contract enforcement enables complex transactions. Political stability attracts domestic and foreign capital. Low corruption reduces wasteful diversion of resources. The rule of law protects citizens and businesses from arbitrary government action. Countries with strong institutions consistently outperform those with weak institutions, regardless of resource endowments or geographic characteristics. Corruption indices reveal vast differences. Denmark, New Zealand, and Singapore rank as least corrupt. Somalia, South Sudan, and Syria rank most corrupt. These differences correlate strongly with development outcomes. Corruption diverts public spending from productive uses to politician enrichment. It discourages honest entrepreneurs while rewarding well-connected rent seekers. It undermines trust in government and market institutions. Geography and natural resources influence development, though not deterministically. Tropical climates face higher disease burdens, including malaria. Landlocked countries incur higher trade costs. However, Singapore prospered despite lacking resources and space. Switzerland developed without coastline access. Botswana achieved sustained growth through sound institutions managing diamond wealth. Meanwhile, resource-rich nations including Nigeria, Venezuela, and Democratic Republic of Congo remain poor, victims of the resource curse, where natural wealth finances corruption, undermines democracy, and crowds out productive activities. Human capital and health investments yield high returns in developing countries. Each additional year of schooling raises earnings by roughly 10%. Improved health increases productivity directly through reduced sick days and enhanced cognitive function. Vaccination programs, clean water provision, and malaria prevention generate enormous benefits relative to costs. Yet many poor countries underinvest due to budget constraints, corruption, and coordination failures. Infrastructure deficits constrain development severely. Electricity remains unreliable or absent in many regions. Roads connecting rural producers to urban markets remain unpaved or non-existent. Port facilities lack capacity. Telecommunications coverage remains spotty. These gaps raise business costs, discourage investment, and isolate populations from economic opportunities. Infrastructure requires massive capital investment and long planning horizons that poor countries struggle to mobilize. Agricultural productivity in developing countries lags far behind developed nation levels. African farmers produce roughly 1/5 the yield per hectare that American or European farmers achieve. Limited fertilizer use, lack of irrigation, poor seed quality, and inadequate storage contribute to these gaps. Small farm sizes prevent economies of scale. Lack of credit prevents purchasing inputs. Poor roads make transporting crops expensive. Improving agricultural productivity could lift millions from poverty, given that most of the world's poor work in agriculture. Microfinance and financial inclusion have expanded dramatically since the 1980s, following Muhammad Yunus's pioneering work with Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, recognized with the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006. Small loans to poor entrepreneurs, particularly women, enable productive investments impossible otherwise. Mobile banking through cellular networks has revolutionized financial access in many African nations, with Kenya's M-Pesa serving millions who lack traditional bank accounts. Foreign aid debates continue despite decades of experience. Roughly $200 billion flows annually from developed to developing countries through official development assistance. Proponents argue that aid finances critical infrastructure, health, and education investments that poor countries cannot afford. Critics contend that aid perpetuates dependency, finances corruption, and relieves governments of pressure to reform. Empirical evidence produces mixed results, suggesting aid effectiveness depends on recipient institutions, donor practices, and program design. Structural transformation from agriculture toward industry and services accompanies development historically. Britain, America, and Japan followed this path during industrialization. South Korea achieved rapid transformation through export-oriented manufacturing. China's growth since 1980 reflects similar patterns, moving hundreds of millions from rural agriculture into urban factories. This transformation requires infrastructure, education, and institutional changes enabling resource reallocation. International trade and investment play crucial roles. Export-oriented strategies in East Asia produced rapid growth. Import substitution policies in Latin America generated disappointing results. Foreign direct investment brings capital, technology, and management expertise. However, integration into global markets creates winners and losers domestically, requiring policies addressing distributional consequences. South Korea exemplifies development success. Devastated by war in the 1950s, with income levels comparable to sub-Saharan Africa, South Korea implemented export promotion, education investment, and institutional reforms. Income per capita now exceeds $30,000. Life expectancy increased from 50 years to over 80 years. China's growth since 1980, lifting 800 million from poverty, represents history's largest and fastest poverty reduction. Botswana achieved sustained growth through prudent diamond revenue management and democratic institutions. Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee pioneered randomized controlled trials in development economics, work recognized with the Nobel Prize in 2019 along with Michael Kremer. These experiments test specific interventions rigorously, including deworming programs, microcredit, and education reforms. The evidence-based approach improves understanding of what actually works rather than relying on theory or ideology alone. Development economics reveals no universal formula for escaping poverty. Countries face different obstacles requiring different solutions, yet common themes emerge. Effective institutions, human capital investment, openness to trade, infrastructure development, and stable macroeconomic conditions appear repeatedly in success stories. Political economy constraints often matter more than economic knowledge. Elites may resist reforms threatening their privileges. Ethnic divisions may prevent cooperation on public goods. Weak state capacity may prevent implementing known solutions. These political and social factors complicate purely economic prescriptions. Beyond traditional development concerns, contemporary economies confront emerging challenges requiring economic analysis. Climate change, technological disruption, rising inequality, and financial instability pose questions demanding sophisticated policy responses, balancing multiple competing objectives. Contemporary economic policy confronts challenges both novel and perennial, each demanding sophisticated analysis yet resisting simple solutions. Climate change threatens environmental catastrophe, requiring coordination across nations and generations. Technological progress disrupts labor markets and raises questions about distributional consequences. Income and wealth inequality have risen in most developed countries, threatening social cohesion and political stability. Financial systems remain prone to crises despite regulatory reforms following 2008. Globalization produces aggregate benefits while creating concentrated losses that generate political backlash. These issues intersect and compound, requiring policymakers to balance competing objectives and navigate trade-offs between efficiency, equity, and stability. Climate change represents the ultimate negative externality. Greenhouse gas emissions impose costs globally and intertemporally. A ton of carbon dioxide emitted today warms the planet for decades, affecting people worldwide, regardless of emission location. This creates classic collective action problems. Each nation benefits from others, reducing emissions while maintaining its own. Future generations bear costs of current consumption. Markets left unregulated produce excessive emissions because decision makers ignore external damages. Economic analysis suggests carbon pricing through taxes or cap-and-trade systems as efficient responses. A carbon tax equal to marginal social damage internalizes the externality, making fossil fuel prices reflect true costs, including climate impacts. Sweden implemented carbon taxes in 1991, now exceeding $100 per tonne, while maintaining economic growth. British Columbia introduced carbon taxes in 2008 with revenue-neutral implementation through offsetting tax reductions elsewhere. The European Union operates a cap-and-trade system, covering major emitters, though price volatility and low prices during economic downturns have limited effectiveness. Cost-benefit analysis of climate policy involves deep uncertainty and contentious value judgments. Discount rates for evaluating far future damages prove crucial yet controversial. Using typical market interest rates of 5 to 7% makes damages a century hence appear nearly worthless. Using near-zero rates, as the Stern Review recommended, makes future damages dominate present costs. These technical choices reflect fundamental ethical questions about obligations to future generations. Renewable energy technologies have improved dramatically. Solar and wind power costs have fallen by factors of 10 over 2 decades, reaching cost parity with fossil fuels in many locations. Battery storage advances address intermittency challenges. However, transition from fossil fuel infrastructure requires enormous investment and faces political opposition from affected industries and workers. Carbon capture technology remains expensive and unproven at scale. Technological change, particularly automation and artificial intelligence, raises concerns about labor market disruption. Historical technological revolutions displaced workers from declining industries while creating new opportunities elsewhere. Agricultural mechanization eliminated farming jobs. Manufacturing automation reduced factory employment. Service sector growth absorbed displaced workers. However, contemporary automation may differ qualitatively, potentially affecting cognitive tasks previously immune to mechanization. Skill-biased technological change over recent decades increased demand for highly educated workers, while reducing demand for routine middle-skill jobs. This pattern explains wage stagnation for workers without college degrees despite productivity growth. Studies estimate that 10 to 50% of current jobs face high automation risk over coming decades, though estimates vary widely based on assumptions about technological capabilities and economic feasibility. Policy responses include education and retraining programs helping workers adapt to changing skill demands. However, retraining proves difficult for displaced older workers and often fails to generate credentials equivalent to displaced occupations. Universal basic income proposals would provide unconditional cash payments to all citizens, decoupling income from employment. Proponents argue this addresses technological unemployment while simplifying welfare systems. Critics cite high costs, work disincentive effects, and questions about adequacy of proposed payment levels. Alaska's permanent fund dividend provides a modest existing example, distributing oil revenue to residents. Income and wealth inequality have increased substantially since 1980 in most developed nations. The Gini coefficient for the United States rose from 0.35 to 0.48. The top 1% income share doubled from 10 to 20%. Wealth inequality exceeds income inequality, with the top 1% owning roughly 40% of wealth. Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st century documented these patterns internationally, arguing that returns to capital systematically exceed economic growth rates, concentrating wealth absent countervailing forces. Multiple factors contribute to rising inequality. Technological change favors skilled workers as discussed. Globalization reduces manufacturing wages for workers competing with imports, while benefiting professionals in traded services. Union membership declined from over 30% to 10% in the United States, weakening worker bargaining power. Top marginal tax rates fell from over 70% in the 1970s to under 40% currently. Executive compensation exploded relative to average worker pay from roughly 30 times to over 300 times. Consequences of inequality extend beyond distributional fairness. High inequality may reduce economic growth by limiting human capital investment among constrained populations. It correlates with reduced intergenerational mobility, as children's outcomes increasingly depend on parents' resources. Political instability may increase as diverging economic experiences fuel polarization. Health outcomes worsen for lower-income populations. Policy responses include progressive taxation, with proposals for higher top rates or wealth taxes on large fortunes. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders proposed wealth taxes during 2020 presidential campaigns. Implementation challenges include valuation difficulties for illiquid assets and capital flight to lower tax jurisdictions. Education investment, particularly early childhood programs, may enhance opportunity and mobility. Strengthening labour market institutions, including minimum wages and collective bargaining, could raise wages at the bottom. However, political obstacles limit adoption of redistributive policies in many countries. Financial instability persists despite reforms following 2008. The crisis originated in housing market speculation and financial engineering, including mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations. Leverage, interconnectedness, and opacity created systemic vulnerability. When housing prices fell, defaults surged, financial institutions faced insolvency, credit markets froze, economic output collapsed. Regulatory responses included the Dodd-Frank Act in the United States, increasing capital requirements for banks, stress testing large institutions, and creating resolution authority for failing firms. Basel III international standards strengthened bank capital and liquidity requirements. However, financial innovation continues outpacing regulation. Shadow banking, including private equity and hedge funds, operates outside traditional oversight. Too big to fail problems remain as largest banks have grown larger. Cryptocurrency and decentralized finance create new systemic risks poorly understood by regulators. Systemic risk, the possibility that Individual institution failures cascade through interconnected financial systems, poses unique challenges. Traditional regulation focuses on individual firm safety and soundness. Systemic regulation must consider network effects and collective behavior that generates fragility even when individual firms appear sound. Macroprudential policy attempts to manage system-wide risks through counter-cyclical capital requirements and limits on leverage during booms. Globalization produces aggregate gains through trade and investment, but creates distributional consequences, generating political backlash. Manufacturing job losses in developed countries, while partly attributable to automation, also reflect import competition, particularly from China after its 2001 World Trade Organization accession. Affected workers and communities experience lasting damage, including reduced earnings, higher disability claims, and increased mortality. Economists' assurances about aggregate benefits ring hollow to those bearing concentrated costs. Trade adjustment assistance programs attempt to compensate losers, but funding remains inadequate and retraining often proves ineffective. Geographic immobility due to housing costs and family ties prevents workers from relocating to opportunity. Political movements opposing further trade liberalisation have gained strength, contributing to Brexit, Trump's election, and rising support for nationalist parties globally. These contemporary challenges share common features, demanding economic analysis, yet resisting purely technical solutions. They involve trade-offs between competing objectives that cannot be reconciled fully. They require coordination across jurisdictions and time periods, creating collective action problems. They generate winners and losers, creating political obstacles to efficient policies. Economic analysis can clarify costs and benefits, identify policy tools, and predict consequences. However, it cannot resolve fundamental value conflicts about equity versus efficiency, present versus future, and national versus global welfare. These normative judgments lie outside economics' analytical scope, residing instead in political philosophy and democratic deliberation. Economic thinking has evolved considerably in addressing such questions. Understanding this evolution provides context for current debates and suggests how economic understanding may continue developing as new challenges emerge and new analytical tools become available. Despite economics' ancient roots in questions of household management and state finance, systematic analysis emerged relatively recently. The discipline that contemporary students encounter represents centuries of intellectual development, with each generation building on and sometimes overturning previous understanding. The evolution from moral philosophy through mathematical formalism to empirical rigor reflects both theoretical progress and responses to practical economic problems demanding solutions. Pre-classical thought focused on moral and ethical aspects of economic activity. Medieval scholars debated just prices and condemned usury. Mercantilists in the 16th and 17th centuries advocated accumulating gold and silver through trade surpluses, viewing international commerce as zero-sum competition. Physiocrats in 18th century France identified agriculture as the sole source of surplus value, dismissing manufacturing and commerce as sterile activities. Classical economics emerged with Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in 1776. Smith articulated how self-interested behavior in markets promotes social welfare through the invisible hand. He emphasized division of labor as a source of productivity growth and argued against mercantilist restrictions on trade. David Ricardo developed the theory of comparative advantage in 1817, demonstrating gains from trade, even when one nation possesses absolute advantage in all goods. Thomas Malthus warned that population growth would outpace food production, condemning humanity to subsistence. Jean-Baptiste Say formulated Say's law, claiming that supply creates its own demand, and general gluts of unsold goods are impossible. The marginalist revolution during the 1870s introduced mathematical analysis. William Stanley Jevons in England, Karl Menger in Austria, and Leon Walras in Switzerland independently developed utility theory and marginal analysis. These tools transformed economics from literary discourse into mathematical science, enabling precise formulations and rigorous derivations. The neoclassical synthesis of the late 19th and early 20th centuries combined marginal analysis with broader economic questions. Alfred Marshall's Principles of Economics became the standard text, introducing supply and demand diagrams still used today. The Keynesian Revolution followed the Great Depression. John Maynard Keynes's General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, published in 1936, challenged classical assumptions about automatic market adjustment to full employment. Keynes emphasized aggregate demand failures and advocated government intervention to stabilize economic fluctuations. His ideas dominated macroeconomic policy from the 1940s through 1970s. Monetarism emerged as a counterpoint in the 1960s and 1970s. Milton Friedman argued that monetary instability, rather than demand failures, causes economic fluctuations. He advocated stable money growth rules and criticized discretionary fine-tuning. Stagflation during the 1970s, with simultaneous inflation and unemployment, challenged Keynesian orthodoxy and vindicated monetarist concerns about inflation. New classical economics during the 1980s incorporated rational expectations and emphasized market clearing. Robert Lucas argued that systematic policy cannot affect real variables, a critique that reshaped macroeconomic modeling. Real business cycle theory attributed fluctuations to technology shocks rather than demand failures. New Keynesian economics synthesized insights from various schools, incorporating rational expectations while maintaining roles for sticky prices and market imperfections. This synthesis represents contemporary mainstream macroeconomics, though debates continue about appropriate policy responses to specific situations. Behavioral economics represents a more recent development, incorporating psychological insights documented since the 1970s. This extension enriches rather than replaces traditional analysis. The evolution reveals both progress and limitations. Economists understand far more about market mechanisms, business cycles, and policy tools than their predecessors. Mathematical and statistical methods have improved dramatically. Data availability has expanded exponentially, yet fundamental questions remain unsettled. Optimal inequality levels, appropriate government roles, and causes of growth continue generating scholarly debate and policy disagreement. Like all social sciences, economics must grapple with human behavior that evolves and adapts. Systems once well understood change as institutions adjust and agents learn. This ensures that economic understanding will continue developing, refining earlier insights, while confronting new puzzles that each generation must address anew. Economics is perhaps most recognizable in the forms we encounter in our daily lives: prices at the grocery store or interest rates on a mortgage. Yet its principles stretch far beyond the checkout line. These fundamental concepts are at work in government policy, in international relations, and most critically, in determining how societies allocate scarce resources. Economics serves as the study of choice under scarcity, examining how individuals, businesses, and governments make decisions when resources are limited, but wants are unlimited. Through this process of analysis, economists seek to understand patterns in production, consumption, and distribution. Like other social sciences, economics relies on human behavior as its subject matter, though unlike psychology or sociology, it focuses specifically on decisions involving material welfare and resource allocation. Without economic analysis, the global marketplace would remain an incomprehensible collection of transactions with no underlying logic. In addition to explaining individual choices, economics also examines systemic outcomes. Markets coordinate millions of independent decisions, somehow transforming self-interested behavior into orderly patterns of production and exchange. Meanwhile, governments intervene to correct market failures, redistribute income, and stabilize economic fluctuations. The term economics comes from the Greek oikonomia, meaning household management, and appropriately so. Many economic principles involve managing resources efficiently, though not all economic activity is so rational or tidy. Some decisions reflect psychological biases, others respond to institutional constraints rather than pure market forces. The discipline divides into two main branches: microeconomics and macroeconomics. Microeconomics examines individual decision makers, including consumers purchasing goods and firms producing them. Macroeconomic studies aggregate phenomena such as national output, unemployment, and inflation. These organisms are gathered under the umbrella of economic science, a field that has evolved considerably since its systematic origins in the 18th century. While economists have catalogued principles governing exchange and production, debates persist about policy applications and optimal institutional arrangements. Among the central questions are familiar challenges: how to promote prosperity, reduce poverty, and balance efficiency against equity. All represent tensions within economics, which in turn resides within the broader domain of social sciences. Though economics once overlapped considerably with moral philosophy, it has become increasingly mathematical and empirical. Unlike purely theoretical disciplines, economics depends on data to test hypotheses and refine models. Economists measure variables, estimate relationships, and forecast outcomes, though predictions remain uncertain given the complexity of human systems and the constant evolution of economic institutions.